castle walls before noon. Goran practically crushed her in a desperate hug on sight. He'd been sitting with his father and Lord Glover outside the room. Lady Sybil's screams were quite loud, sending chills down Arya's spine. She sat down with Lady Mage. Questions circled through her thoughts, slipping out before she could stop them. Is that going to happen to me? Mage looked down at her. What makes you say that? Arya shrugged. Father wrote to me, she admitted. He talked about setting up a betrothal between me and... Arya leaned in close. Goran. The pain is hard, you'll probably never feel anything like it, Mage explained. But children, even those born of duty, can bring great joy. The door was thrown open and the midwife exited with a bloody apron tied to her waist. Your wife and your baby are in good health, my lord. Lord Robert and Galbart entered first before Mage, Arya and Goran were invited in. It was quite the scene. Lady Sybil was laid out exhausted in the bed. Held against her chest was a small pink shape. Arya thought the newest Glover looked like a piece of pork that had been taken out of the oven early. Maybe that was harsh, she didn't say that to Lady Sybil, of course. Hello Arya, this is Irina Glover. Sybil said, angling the baby so Arya could see the infant's wrinkled face. I want to ask you to help me look after her, Arya. She'll need someone to look up to. Me. Arya was shocked. Agreeing would make her a big sister. Arya thought that may not be so bad. She could be like Jon, a protector, someone to make Irina feel better, feel loved. Arya looked up at Sybil and smiled. On my honor as a Stark, I'll do my very best. // Chapter 17, Distant Shores. Chapter text. Jon's first breath outside the gates of Winterfell was unique. It was clear, it was cold, and for the first time in Jon's life, he felt like he was taking a step forward. The trip to White Harbor was far from easy. Their party was quite large. Fitting as Bran's fostering with the Mandaealis was an important diplomatic gesture. Jory Castle led their guard while Born and Jon kept Bran company. His brother was excited but clearly nervous. Bran had been even further removed from the small folk than Jon and wasn't old enough to go roughhousing with the younger servants like Arya. The young Stark admitted by the fireside that Sansa's name day had been his first chance to speak with other nobles his age. Jon did his best to reassure him that he would make fast friends and that if he paid attention to his lessons, he would make connections quickly enough. Before their arrival, Bran huddled next to Jon and watched as Summer and Ghost scrounged for dinner. Jon. Bran whispered, leaning his weight into his brother's side. Can you stay with me in Newcastle? The request didn't shock Jon. Bran's nerves ran thin the further they traveled down the White Knife. I'm afraid not. He replied. You've got an important duty ahead of you. Is that why you can't stay? You have a duty too? Bran asked. The fire filled the silence. I have to take a different path, Bran. Is it because you're not trueborn? Jon blinked down at Bran, who was cuddling Summer. Yes, Jon admitted, but you're still my brother. I'm going to find a way to help our family, be someone father can be proud of. Eventually, we'll both return home. You'll be a knight, clad in plate with a great lance on a heavy steed. Jon poked his brother's stomach, with maidens clutching your cloak and throwing flowers at your feet. Bran laughed. His eyes were shining, but ever so slightly, they faded in color. The fire was low, the birds and insects muted. Bran's smile slacked, and he drank in Jon's face. You'll wear a heavy cloak of many names and wrap it around a snow-touched bride. War will echo in your home, and peace will break at your word. The wolves shall circle in iron and bring forth blood from the frozen stone. With his final words, Bran's eyes fell shut, and the boy was fast asleep. Jon held his brother close, but nothing seemed amiss. Born slowly sat up from his cot and helped Jon set Bran down. The two didn't speak but contemplated the strange pronouncement in silence. Jon knew that Born suspected Arya and Bran had extremely potent dreaming, but prophecy was a dangerous thing. He'd read through the shipwright's memoirs. The ancient king had been enraptured with the sea from an early age. That interest turned to obsession when a wandering shepherd told him that a Stark would one day sail west from the north and land in its east. Instead, the king disappeared, and his son burned the Northern Navy in his grief. Vague words and desperate hopes were a poisonous mixture. Thankfully, the young boy showed no memory of his trance the next day. Bran's nerves settled overnight, and he was eager to take in all the sights of White Harbor. The seat of House Marndale held little resemblance to Maestlewin's descriptions of other northern centers. It was the only proper city north of the Neck, filled with straight cobbled streets and rows of white stone homes. They were treated to the sight of the inner and outer harbors. The field of sails and flags caught the sunlight over the waves like a portrait. Newcastle itself was wide and tall. The Merman's Keep sat on the hill overlooking the city, the Wolf's Den and the September of snow stood out among the landscape. Their horses were taken away, leaving Jory and John to escort Bran into the Marndale court. Bourne took the majority of the guard to one of the lower halls for a meal. John very nearly joined them before the Marndale steward cleared his throat. "Lord Bran, if you and yours would follow me." The halls and court were filled. Not just by minor houses, John saw the many smaller sigils of knightly houses. By chance, Summer and Ghost slipped past the steward's notice and kept close to their partners. The steward announced their arrival to the court proper. "All rise for the son of Lord Stark, Brandon Stark." The court turned their full attention on wide-eyed Bran, who swallowed and stepped forward. From his throne on the dais, Lord Marndale stepped down and met their party on the tiled floor. "Lord Marndale, on behalf of my family, I thank you for your hospitality." Bran did his best to stand tall. Lord Wyman was gracious enough to take Bran's declaration with gravitas. He leaned down and gently grasped arms with the boy. "It is an honor to have you here, Lord Bran." A few other public comments were made. They were directed towards a side corridor that led up into the castle proper, where Bran's provided chambers were. John was prepared to let Bran get settled and rejoin Bourne when he was stopped by the maid. "Lord Marndale has set aside a room next to Lord Stark for you, sir." John frowned at the older servant but followed her nevertheless. True to her word, a smaller room down the hall had been aired out. Bran's room had been fully furnished. This chamber had the basic amenities, but it was better than the barracks room that Jory and Bourne would be housed in. The maid watched Ghost with some trepidation. The wolf was the size of a full-grown hound. After washing his face, John changed into some fresher clothes. Setting down his personal bag, he reached into the bottom pocket, pulling out a small silver medal and chain. A gift from his father. Hardened bronze shaped into a round disc. On one face, a leaping wolf was plated in silver above his house words, reversed, a sword above some faint runes, "Blood of Stark" they read. John attached the chain and medallion to his chest. Their first evening in White Harbor was a pleasant reprieve from the road. Lord Marndale allowed Bran to take an early supper, and soon enough, the Stark party was asleep. Bourne had planned to spend a week or two in the city waiting for a ship that often frequented Skagos to make port. Bran was happy enough to have John and the shepherd on hand. The young Stark settled in quickly and found several playmates among the Marndales and their more prestigious sworn families. Many of these boys had older brothers who were squires or were squires themselves. Every afternoon Bran dragged his companions to watch the men-at-arms drill and the knights drill. The training fields outside of Newcastle were large and well maintained. They clacked as Severick, an older knight, expertly smashed aside the shield and helmets of several dummies. John was amazed by the dexterity of the veteran warrior. His own skill on the horse was acceptable, thanks to Sir Roderick. Bran was definitely impressed. He leaned back from the fence and looked to Bourne. "You never talked about jousting before, Bourne. Did the first men do it?" Bran asked. Bourne adjusted his jacket, a Stark guardsman suit that he'd been leaned to blend in. "They didn't," he responded. Bran scratched his head. Was it because they didn't have knights? Bourne shook his head, more so due to tradition and materials. In the old days, the cavalry was lightly armored. One of the old mounds on Skagos has a wonderful portrait of a horseman. They carried double-ended spears with either maces or blades at their waist. "No lances," Bran said. "First men horse rarely charged. Their duty was to be swift and responsive." There's an account by House Roll about how they trained their men to reinforce weaknesses in the battalion or sweep to the flanks. Bourne explained. Of course, if the enemy also had cavalry, then naturally, the two forces clashed. What about after the Andal invasion? John interjected. Bourne laughed. Then the joust was a pastime of the invaders. They also heard rumors about deaths and accidents. More than a few Magners refused to risk crippling their cavalry in a contest. John nodded. It made sense to him and his very northern world view. Bran frowned. I was hoping there'd be some Stark prince who was a master jouster. The boy admitted. Bourne cringed. Just because they didn't joust didn't mean they had no competitions. The shepherd clasped his charge around the shoulders. What the Andals called the melee was already an ancient pastime for first men. Bran brightened up instantly. During festivals and grand feasts, the Magners would host great grafts. Pit fights with blunted weapons. Looking back, it was a bit hypocritical to shun the joust, a fair share of sons died all the same. Bourne outlined. John chuckled, I bet it was cheaper than buying a horse and a full set of plate. True, true. Bourne agreed. If I recall correctly, the graft was most popular in the Stormlands. There were even a few champions who made their living traveling across Westeros. Were the grafts the only sport? Bran asked. Far from it. Bourne exclaimed. Towns across the kingdoms held contests every year. The rest of the afternoon, the Stark boys laughed along as Bourne described ancient games of lumber throwing, target calling, horse mounting, and more. Day by day, Bran became more comfortable with White Harbor. Lord Wyman had a keen sense and quickly filled in as a paternal figure for Bran. Taking time to include the Stark son in family activities and discussions. What surprised John was that the Lord of the White Knife spared attention for him as well. He encouraged John to make use of the training field and even lent him some sparring weapons. Bourne cautioned him to keep in mind that bastard sons raised alongside the heir of a house are not easily ignored. The Marndaelis were nothing if not cunning and adaptable. John blushed when Bourne suggested that a distant Marndaeli cousin would not be a bad match for him. Nearly a full moon had passed in White Harbor when Bourne informed him that their ship had docked. Bran took their departure surprisingly well, giving John a tight embrace before running off with his band of friends. His final night in Newcastle was nerve-wracking. After a hearty dinner, John took a stroll along the castle walls to be met by the considerable shadow of Wyman Marndaeli. Lord Marndaeli. John bowed. Please stand, young John, stand. The merman asked. He guided John along the battlements. I must say, I'm quite impressed with Lord Bran. John nodded, he does the Starks proud. I know how excited he is to be here. It's difficult not to notice how he stares after the lances and horses. I've already begun planning his tutoring. You can be sure that he'll master the saddle by the time he grows his first chin hairs. Lord Wyman certainly loved to laugh. You've also made an impression, John. I won't lie, many in my household were surprised that Lord Stark would send you to accompany your brother. I was making my way east regardless. It was convenient for me to accompany Bran. John responded. Lord Stark made it clear to me that he holds you in high esteem, Marndaeli informed him. I can see for myself your excellent manners. My master-at-arms has commented more than once on your skill in the yards. John distracted himself from the compliments by petting Ghost. In fact, were you not already on an errand, I'd extend an offer to you to join my household. Wyman finished. John tripped over his own feet as he jumped to attention. At a loss for words, John sputtered out some mangled apology. Wyman held up a hand. Worry not, I'm unsure if Lord Stark would approve in any case. I have a notion that you have quite a future ahead of you, Jon Snow. John stared into Wyman's eyes. What makes you say that, my lord? His host smirked. There aren't many places to visit in the east. Word from the dock says that your companion has bought passage aboard the Ice Tide. A peculiar vessel. It makes frequent trips up the coast, always light on cargo but laden with passengers. John very deliberately kept his shoulders relaxed. My father, Lord Stark, was hoping to gain insight into the farthest corners of the north. He's quite busy, so he sent me in his stead. The story was not wholly false. John's father did want to get insight into the goings-on of Skagos. Wyman stroked his prominent chin. A wise choice. I'm sure you'll enjoy the brisk waters. Do be careful though, I've been told that many years have passed since a Stark has visited those shores, not to mention one accompanied by a member of the older stock. His final advice mitted out, Lord Wyman bid John and Ghost a good night and walked off, leaving behind a nervous Snow who began to reconsider his assumption that because the Mandaelis followed the Seven, they were blind to the business of the shepherds. // Packed away on his first actual ship, John allowed the worries of the mainland to fade and embraced the awe of the sea. Ice Tide was a moderately sized vessel that cut swiftly through the bight and up the rocky shore. It was crewed by Captain Thrin and his 3 sons. By all appearances, they were a typical trading vessel. Their true affiliations shone in the intricate carvings along the inner hull. Runes could be felt above each doorway, and a moles hung from the sail rigging. The boys would often slip into Old Tongue by accident only to be scolded by their father. Thrin is one of our best sailors. He cut his teeth making trade voyages to Bravos when he was younger, then started doing business on Skagos. Now he's content with being a shepherd's ship. Bourne explained. I didn't think the Skagos traded with outsiders, John stated. Make no mistake, Skagos is a wild land. The stone men are as hard and vicious as any story of the wildlings. Despite what some call their savagery, the people still need to live. The Boltons, Karstarks, even the Night's Watch have dealt with them for many centuries. Depending on who holds power among the clans, trade or raids come and go with the tide. John thought back to his lessons. The last time Skagos were widely seen was during the reign of Barthogan Stark, the son of Cregan Stark, correct? The Skagos rebellions tended to be quick and brutal. Mayor Stillowin only covered them briefly. The Stark histories had even less to say on the matter. Father had mentioned that Barthogan Stark wrote little of it. In fact, his writings were scarce for most of his reign. Bourne pulled out supplies for a new carving, a gift for Captain Thrin's wife. On Skagos, the title of Lord changes hands easily, the shepherd explained. Age or illness will weaken the seated rulers, then rivals will gather power through disputes and small skirmishing. Finally, an open challenge will be called, and a rebel fights for the seat. When they succeed, they usurp not just the power and authority but also the name. Who knows how many bloodlines have been called Magna, Krall, or Stain. Bourne's carvings tended to be palm-sized, his new work was closer to a forearm in length. During Barthogan's generation, a rising chieftain usurped House Magna, but he didn't stop there. This chieftain was cunning, through tactics, and some say sorcery, he conquered the whole isle. Bourne said. All 3 houses fell to him. John was entranced. The Stone King, he called himself. His detractors whispered that he drank too much weirwood sap, a cup with every meal. Others said his parents were brother and sister, that his madness and ambition were born from the womb. Regardless, this Stone King wished to rule over the mainland too, so he rebelled against distant Winterfell, setting his ravagers loose from the Bay of Seals all the way down to the Bight. The wildlings have never been that effective. How did he expect to win? John inquired. Bourne cut away large pieces, letting the slivers of wood pool at his feet. Rather than burning villages, he turned them into forts and built strong wooden walls, Bourne revealed. The northern lords thought this a poor tactic stemming from arrogance. House Ramhart among them. They sallied out to attack one of these captured villages in full force. They broke through the walls easily enough only to find the fort was nothing but a sham, just a huge pit of spikes and filth hidden by sticks and dirt. Bourne grimaced. When the Ramharts rushed in, they fell into the trap, killed at the Skagos' leisure. The Stone King went on to sack Ramsgate. John could hardly imagine it. You said they invaded up and down the coast. Did no one else meet them in battle? Strangely, the Boltons refused to ride out, Bourne mentioned. Likewise, the Skagos never strayed too far into lands of the flayed men. Instead, their strength focused on Widow's Watch, Carhold, and skirmishes with the Mandaelis. Ramsgate fell a year after the Stone King declared independence. I find it hard to believe the Starks would stand idly while a castle was occupied, Jon interjected. The course of fate was against them, Bourne replied. A few weeks before news of the rebels reached Winterfell, Lord Jonel Stark passed from an infection. Jonel was not well liked, his younger brother Barthogen even less so. A whale's head was forming under Bourne's fingers. All families have their disagreements, Jon Bourne reminded. At the time of Jonel's death, he had no heir. The children of Cregan Stark feared that their cousins, the descendants of their great-uncle Bernard, would contest the rule of Winterfell. Bernard's line had married into the Karstarks, you see. Barthogen and his siblings had distanced themselves and made other allies. Likewise, relations with the Marndaelis were hampered by the passing over of Serena Stark, Cregan's eldest grandchild, and the death of Sansa, Jonel's wife. Serena Stark and her mother, Rillin Marndaeli, returned to White Harbor. House Stark was divided. Bourne explained. It was astonishing, Jon thought, that suspicion and disagreement could cripple the most powerful family in the north to the point of inaction. Even a rebellion could not forge a common cause between them. Jon clarified. You'd be surprised what a noble family would allow when their authority is in danger. Bourne chuckled. All three branches of the family were wary of going to war. Change can happen quickly when lords are stuck on the front lines, and death comes without warning. A tail swooped out of the wood's end, curling into a full circle. Thankfully, Barthogen was pushed into action by the sack of Ramsgate and the burning of Karstark farms. He marshaled a small army and rode to White Harbor. The next half-year was spent riding east with the Marndaelis and Flints, hunting down the raiders, Bourne recounted. It all came to an end when Barthogen Stark trapped the Skagga Sea between his forces. The Stone King disappeared during that final battle. His armor was found in the aftermath, split along the back and caked in blood. Barthogen also died there, Jon added. Bourne nodded. His younger brother Brandon took charge and drove the stone men back into the sea, all the way back to Skagos. Shouts from Captain Thrin interrupted their discussion. Bourne clapped Jon's shoulder, speaking of which, we've arrived. The waves settled as ice tide floated onward. A bright overcast sky let streams of sunlight streak across the open water. From the prow, Jon looked upon the Isle of Stone. It was the largest island Jon had ever seen, none of the small outcropping they'd passed, or even the glimpse of the Three Sisters compared. High stone peaks sunk into the sky, and by all appearances, the land beneath was similarly edged with high rocks and sparse greenery. Sharp outcroppings, violent waves, and treacherous shorelines warned away any passerbys. Jon was beginning to wonder how they were going to land if the island itself was prepared to kill them for daring to approach. Captain Thrin was undaunted. Their vessel circled Skagos until they reached a gap in the rocks. They sailed through a narrow gap between two stone cliffs and found themselves beneath a canopy of thin trees. This was the Wold, Jon would later learn, the path away to reach the eastern part of Skagos without facing the storms of the Bay of Seals. It crept back and forth inside a slight stretch of forest that lived at the foot of the giant peaks. At its end was a small lake. A village rested on the far shore, equipped with a few docks cluttered by fishing boats. Captain Thrin flew up a small flag that bore a simple whale, which looked quite similar to the wooden carving Bourne had finished on their voyage. Some sign must have responded because the captain guided them to the single thick dock that jutted out into the water. Thrin's sons scrambled about, throwing mooring lines to a few people on the dock. Bourne and Jon gathered their bags and supplies. Ghost, who had been quite discontent for most of the journey, was bounding about the deck, eager to touch land. I wonder what the Skagga Sea would think of a Stark visiting, Jon theorized. Though I suppose a bastard son wouldn't cause that much commotion. Bourne shook his finger. I'd hold off on your assumptions. You're a Stark, the people here don't have much of a concept of bastardy. Stay vigilant. If they find out that Lord Stark is your father, I can't predict their reactions. They wouldn't try to kill me, would they? Jon yelled. Bourne shushed him. Keep it down. I just said I can't guess. Technically, by defeating the Stone King, House Stark regained their place as the rightful rulers of Skagos. On the other hand, by their logic, fighting you would be a way to earn prestige. Jon paled, imagining a hulking raider aiming to take his head. Bourne tossed over a waterskin. Relax, Jon. Unless you seek them out, I doubt we'll see many Skagga Sea. The shepherd's life separate from the largest villages. We have our own space on the island. Bourne stepped down from the small ramp and settled onto the dock. John made to follow but halted. Are there any shepherds who'd want to fight me? John asked. Bourne turned back and smirked. Forward slash 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 forward slash. Chapter 18, Distant Shores, Part 2. Chapter text. After father had given him leave to visit Skagos, John's imagination had run wild. His mind couldn't settle on what the mysterious place would offer, ancient stone circles covered in glowing runes. People in leaf cloaks running with deer. In his nightmares, stern-faced elders ate raw meat and lived in ashen boneyards, while half-men half-birds perched atop carrion poles. His first true experience in Skagos involved watching Bourne haggle with a half-blind greybeard over how much his potatoes cost. Back and forth in rapid old tongue, John's friend debated on how many rabbit furs a dozen root vegetables were worth. John could follow their bickering quite well, only losing a few words here or there. He took a deep breath and turned away from the stall to take in the village they'd landed in. Captain Thrin had bid them goodbye and led his sons off home. Unlike on Ice Tide, the sailor had no problems using the old tongue. From the docks tight clusters of large homes circled around each other. A wide flat trail led from the water to a roofed clearing that held stalls and tables. People milled about on their business. It perfectly mirrored Wintertown on any given day. He looked down to Ghost, who quietly sat near the stall corner hidden from view. It would be best if his companion stayed with Bourne, less chance of an accident that way. John motioned once with his finger and then moved off alone. Taking in the wares on display, his eye was drawn to embellishments present on even simple tools. Engraved knots on a hammer's handle, careful rune stitches on thick blankets, he noticed even a plough had a stylized ox hammered into the plate. Certainly, their creators were no high-court artisans, but the simple artistic touches displayed a dedication that John admired. Surprisingly, many people wore accessories with their outfits. Unlike the silver and gold that Lady Stark had, these were pieces of bronze, tin and a kind of strange orange jewelry that reminded John of hardened tree sap. His staring did not go unnoticed. A trio of people off to his left huddled together in conversation. In his peripheral vision, John caught their fingers flicking towards him. The last thing he needed was to earn a sour reputation. He quickly moved back towards Bourne. A smooth walking stick flashed into his path. John halted and looked hesitantly to the bearer, a willowy man with short hair and no beard. He had few wrinkles, but a dense field of freckles covered his head and neck. At his back was a woman with arm in arm with a young boy who had similar patches of freckles. This challenger growled out in thick old tongue, "Strangers aren't free to wander here. Who do you answer to, newcomer?" Others took notice of these loud questions and likewise turned their eyes to John. A bastard learns to sense distrust from a young age. He could practically feel the sentiment swelling by the second. "That's a fine piece of steel you carry, intend to use it?" the willowy man asked. John swallowed. He deliberately held his hands away from his waist. "I'm just a visitor," he said. The old tongue came out smoothly. The willowy man pulled back his walking stick but kept it in the air. "A visitor you may be, but a spy can wear many faces." Threats were quite clear in any language. A shift of dirt alerted John to the bodies that had moved too close in on his back. John took a deep breath, then reached into his breast pocket. His fingers clasped around his medallion when the walking stick was pushed into his throat. That's far enough. This man was very suspicious of strangers. Seconds before John could attempt to argue in his own defense, the woman and child behind him shouted and darted away. The willowy man spun on his heels. Hunched forward, Ghost had his fangs bared. Red eyes stared at John's accuser, who had frozen in shock. His direwolf was the same size as the largest hounds of Winterfell. His coat of bright white fur gave the impression of being even larger. "Ghost, heel!" John commanded. The wolf sat but kept the willowy man square in his sights. "Dina, I dearly hope you aren't harassing my guest," Bourne yelled. The shepherd pushed through the crowd, a small bag of potatoes in his hand. The willowy man, Dina apparently, turned on Bourne. "This stranger is with you, shepherd." Bourne stepped up to John and motioned to John's pocket. John took out the medallion and held it up for everyone to see. "He's no stranger, Dina. This is John of Winterfell, son of Eddard Stark," Bourne proclaimed. His announcement set the crowd into furious conversation. The woman behind Dina was grimacing and rubbing her forehead. The boy at her hip did his best to hide behind her skirts. Dina himself looked unaffected. "I'll not apologize for being cautious. Some of us must take care to safeguard our home." Dina twisted, careful to keep his body facing Ghost. "Nadine, what say you?" The crowd parted again for a woman in green robes. A string of teeth and claws was woven around a leather belt that also carried a wooden mask. John knew that Bourne's mask and robe were still packed away. "Your diligence does you credit, Dina," Nadine responded. "Though I would say perhaps pay more caution before confronting young travelers in public. I trust Wolf Tongue's son." She waved her hand and walked back through the spectators. Bourne and John followed. A quick whistle brought Ghost back to his side. Dina threw one last dirty look at their backs before striding back to his own stall. "Is this going to be a common occurrence?" John asked. "I doubt it. Dina's a grump and he doesn't like visitors. This is Basket, it's the largest village on this side of the island. It's also the only village the Shepherds claim sole ownership over," Bourne explained. The pair continued walking. There were still stares, now of awe and even reverence rather than distrust. A few people even gave him slight bows, which embarrassed John greatly. It was Rob who received the respect of strangers, not him. John distracted himself by listening closely to Bourne describe Skagos in more detail. The people of the island were widespread. Outside of the smattering of coastal fishing villages, most people either resided near the households or in small communal homesteads. This included the majority of shepherds, who mingled with the regular folk. The exception was the Great Shepherd and the most venerated of their order. These shepherds lived in a small valley nestled near the tallest of the peaks. Vidian it was called, which John parsed out, was some kind of combination of tutor and birthplace. They found Nadine standing at the village outskirts. A strange black bird with bright red flesh covering its head and neck perched on her arm. Nadine was an older woman, with sparse lengths of grey in her long hair. Her nose and cheeks had a rosy coloring to them that rolled through the wrinkles on her chin. As the bird flew away, Nadine took off the thick leather gauntlet she'd been wearing and clasped arms with Bourne. "John, this is Nadine Bleakwing." "Nadine, this is John of Winterfell," Bourne formally introduced. John bowed. "I'm glad to make your acquaintance." Nadine smiled, "And I yours." The Great Shepherd said that his son was accompanying a visitor. "I didn't expect it to be one of the Stark's own sons. This is a good sign." They set out on a well-trodden dirt path. John kept silent while Nadine shared news with Bourne. Nothing of consequence: gossip, births, deaths, a small list of fights. The conversation drifted to Bourne's family. "How has my sister been? I know she was planning on finding another bird when I left," Bourne mentioned. Nadine shook her head. "Marie isn't on Skagos, she left a few months after you. She did bond again, with a pair of twin eagles. Your father named her Skytongue and sent her on a mission south." Bourne looked to his feet and bit his lips. "I'm glad she earned a name. I'll have to ask the Great Shepherd what errand took her so far from home." Nadine looked closer at him. "That wolf's not yours?" she asked. John felt the need to defend his friend. "Ghost is mine. Although if it wasn't for Bourne I doubt any of the direwolves would have made it to Winterfell. Bourne guided their parents and another wolf from beyond the wall to our home." Bourne smiled and Nadine spoke no more. Forward slash 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 forward slash. It took another hour of calm travel to reach the valley proper. It had no special appearance. Great gates did not bar the entrance, and no statues marked the passage. Instead a small row of waist-high wooden idols were sunken into the path. Each bore a weathered carving and a ring of illegible runes. Nadine had left them a few minutes before with a respectful goodbye. Her own home was further inland near Deepdown, the seat of House Krell. Bourne threaded between the idols and walked along the steep hillside. A small stone staircase led up to the base of the sharpest rock cliff John had ever seen. He feared for a moment they would have to scale it. Thankfully, the staircase curved right into a gap between the hill and rock face. It wasn't visible from the main path due to the trees and the angle of the rocks. The afternoon sun drifted overhead and bathed their passage in bright warmth. The sunlight revealed, to John's shock, ancient weirwood faces sunken into the soil wall to his right. Dozens of eyes and mouths peered out from the dark earth. A select few were nearly crumbling apart, their wooden bodies so corroded by time that their bark was nothing more than soft mulch kept in place by roots and weight. A sudden gust of wind sped along this narrow corridor, knocking John's cloak back and stopping him mid-step. His skin prickled. John shifted his gaze to the faces. Rows of eyes. Dead eyes. Living eyes. They were cutting into him, taking his heart and his worth. They found him weak, found him wanting. His dreams were petty and his wishes were cowardly. He would join them there, beneath the earth. His skin would split and crack. The roots take hold and drink. His own face set into the mud, silent, watching and judging the next soul to walk this trail. A sharp pain broke John from his thoughts. He was on his knees, shivering. Ghost had grabbed his left hand and carefully teethed his fingers. Bourne stood in between them and the wall of faces. Over Bourne's face was the weirwood mask, a heavy stream of red sap leaked from the slanted eyes. The liquid flowed over the long nose and tree-knot nostril, pooling in the grinning mouth before dripping to the ground. For a moment, John saw a small face among the carvings. A face with dull pupils and dark green flesh, it smiled, revealing pointed black teeth. He blinked and leaned into Ghost's side. Bourne stepped back and removed his mask. The wind quieted, the sun slid behind the clouds. "John, are you all right?" John looked up at his cousin. "I think I need some water," he said. Ghost and Bourne helped John to his feet. The path continued for another 10 minutes or so before making another right turn. The second set of stone stairs led down into the open air of the valley. Patches of thick trees painted onto a green grass floor stretched out before them. Smoke trails drifting above the treetops marked the chimneys of quaint houses and the occasional barn. John's heart calmed as Bourne led him past a small herd of sheep grazing. There were shepherds here and there. Well, John assumed they were shepherds, only the occasional person had the green robes. Bourne was taking in the surroundings with a bittersweet air. He stopped for a few moments at most of the homes to greet his neighbors. Children would come running up eager to hear about Bourne's travels or to gawk openly at Ghost. The young ones were unfazed by being introduced to John of Winterfell, but their parents were suitably interested. No one spoke outright, they simply encouraged Bourne to speak with the great shepherd. It might not compare to Winterfell, but welcome to Stoneheart, Bourne declared as he pointed forward. Ahead of them was a sizable patch of grazing land bordering a thicket of old trees. A small hall and other buildings made of stone sat on a hill overlooking the grounds. "Bourne, you're back," someone shouted. Galloping down from the home was a young boy astride a shaggy horse. The rapscallion charged towards them at full tilt. John put a hand onto Ghost, praying that the steed wouldn't rear. With surprising skill, the boy rode parallel to Bourne and leaped straight from the saddle into his arms. They both went tumbling in the dirt. "Rogan, what have I told you about treating your steed like a toy?" The boy couldn't have been older than 12 years old. He looked up at Bourne with a wide grin, highlighting his handful of missing teeth and dark red hair. "Stop being such a hen. I can handle my horses just fine," Rogan complained. Bourne dragged the two of them back up as the shaggy horse trotted over to them. It was smaller than the horses in Winterfell's stables and positively tiny compared to the draft horses he'd seen on the ride to White Harbor. "John, this is Rogan, son of Dogan." "Rogan, this is John, son of Eddard, he's from Winterfell," Bourne introduced for the 10th time. Rogan hopped back into the saddle and bowed slightly. "Nice to meet you. The great shepherd is meeting with someone right now, but I cleaned out your room, Bourne." They followed Rogan back towards the houses. "What happened to my room?" Bourne asked. Rogan shrugged. "After you left, we moved most of the workshop out of the old shed inside." John noticed Bourne's frown and thought it was strange as well. Although the shepherds were a more practical people, repurposing empty space seemed sensible. The house was certainly old. Wooden walls smoothed by wind and weather over the course of decades. Even so, John could pick out the intricate craft that ran along the beams and doorway. The doors were adorned with a bronze knocker formed into a wolf's head. Rogan veered off back towards the stables, leaving Bourne standing at the door with John and Ghost in tow. Their bags were stored inside and Bourne prepared some bread and honey for them. It was a large house with well cared for furniture. The walls in particular sported many trappings, from pelts to ornaments and even the occasional hide painting. Rogan entered after them and eagerly recounted his adventures over the last year. A pleasant afternoon, and a welcome change of pace from the ship ride. Bourne himself was in a pleasant mood. John supposed most people would be happy returning home. The creak of the front door preceded the arrival of Torrin Wolftongue, the great shepherd himself. John and Bourne stood up straight, a hint of nervousness in both their frames. Torrin looked remarkably similar to his son. The same build and height, the same dark hair and eyes. He wore a short beard to complement shoulder-length hair. His robes were a deep green and had silver wire threaded into the chest and sleeves. The shepherd's long face gave credence to his stark blood, though his overall resemblance to John's father was more in likeness than features. When Torrin saw John he smiled and his eyes lit up, a rare reaction for John to see. "Jon Snow!" Torrin exclaimed in the common tongue. He walked forward quickly and grasped his arms. "I welcome you to Skagos. It is truly an honor for the Stoneheart to welcome the son of Lord Stark." John stammered, "And House Stark thanks you for your hospitality." John hoped that response was appropriate. He'd only had a few weeks to wrap his head around how to act as a ward. Bourne stepped forward when Torrin moved toward his eldest son. John noticed Torrin only laid a hand on his shoulder. "Bourne, you have done well. Your mission is over, consider your duties released," Torrin informed him. "Thank you, Father," Bourne replied. "Your room has been prepared. Could you and Rogan ensure that the tables are pulled out of the main room? I expect many visitors tonight and tomorrow," Torrin instructed. Bourne nodded and followed Rogan out of the kitchen. "I've had one of our guest rooms prepared if you'll follow me, John." Torrin gave John a tour of Stoneheart. It had 5 chambers, a large workroom and an open theater where Torrin held meetings and heard disputes. John had been given the largest chamber besides Torrin's own. The tower held a collection of artifacts and heirlooms collected by the inhabitants of Stoneheart over the ages. It was locked, but Torrin said that John needed only ask if he wished to inspect their modest treasures. Ghost was exploring the open space when a trio of smaller wolves approached the house. John tensed but stood his ground beside Torrin. Ghost kept his silence and allowed the wolves to approach and sniff around him, but when they circled Ghost growled and pushed forward. The wolves paused then backed off, going around the direwolf towards a small shack near the barn. "Have you begun warging yet, John?" Torrin asked. "Only in my dreams." "A good start, but I'm confident you have the makings of a great Skingshanger. It's in our blood after all," Torrin declared. "Now come along, we have a busy week ahead of us, there's much to do. // Chapter 19, Distant Shores, Part 3. Chapter text. Living in a castle, especially a castle as grand as Winterfell, truly blinded you to the amount of work life took. The great shepherd may command respect and authority, but his family still needed to cut their own firewood and cook their own meals. John never imagined he was lazy, but struggling to wake up before dawn with Bourne sowed some doubts. Stoneheart had some animals, a small farm, and a workshop that saw constant use. Torrin insisted that John was a guest and could focus on things other than chores. Seeing Bourne and Rogan lugging lumber and corralling the sheep prompted John to join them. He was a ward, which meant he was expected to contribute to his host's household. Rogan even admitted the milking was easier with Ghost around to keep the lambs in one place. The Stoneheart was not an empty place. Torrin showed John various maps of the island, and Vidian itself sat east of the main mountain. Plenty of shepherds cut through it while moving up and down the coast. Dozens came every week to meet with the valley residents, for advice mostly. After finishing their business, Torrin would insist on introducing them to John and holding an informal meeting. Many of these visitors were quite influential on the island, a few of the experienced smiths, the rare stable master, even a few scribes. Occasionally, one of the mysterious shepherds would appear. Elders with hair to their ankles, deep wrinkles, and dark veins under their skin. Bourne told him they went deep into the weirwoods and spent days dreaming and warging. Torrin convinced a few to teach John. His warging with Ghost grew leaps in bounds once he started using their techniques, rune circles to help concentrate and special brews to deepen the tie between beast and man. It took months for John to notice how little time he'd spent with Bourne and how little time Bourne spent with his father. While Torrin kept John busy learning the old tongue and imparting wisdom, Bourne spent more and more time with the young children on the island or hunting on his own. Eventually, Torrin was called away to settle a dispute on the southern Skagos, leaving John free to seek out his cousin. Bourne. John called. His friend looked up from his lap, a bundle of knots between his fingers. The small lake behind him was one of the few scattered within walking distance of Stoneheart, and small fishing boats laid strewn across the pebble shore. Rogan finally chased you off? Bourne asked. John adjusted the rough shirt he'd grabbed on his way out. No, the scamp said his sister was visiting and he headed home. Bourne picked up the fishing poles at his feet and set them into his boat beside a small bucket of bait. I'll be back in a few hours, then I'll start on dinner. John stepped past Bourne, setting his own poles into the boat. Taking a hold, he pushed the boat into the water, glancing back at Bourne. I wanted to come with you. I've never fished in a lake before. Bourne was surprised, a reaction that upset John. Wordlessly he jumped in the boat and the two settled into rowing. The weather was clear and the wind warm. While Bourne set out his fishing lines, John leaned forward. I wanted to apologize. John began. What for? Bourne returned. Your father has been taking up all my time, not to mention his guests. Bourne sat back and pulled a few worms out of the bucket, expertly affixing them his hook. Father has a lot to teach you, John. It's a great honor to be his student. I came to Skagos because of you, Bourne. I wanted to learn from you. John insisted. Bourne looked down and picked at his necklace. The teeth and claws clacked dully together. I'm afraid I don't have much to offer you now. We wouldn't be here if that was true. Torrin could spend days instructing me on how a shepherd should act, but you're the one who brought Ghost to me. John said, motioning to where his direwolf was digging through the rocks ashore. No one back in Wintertown would disagree when I say you have plenty to offer, and I want to learn. Hopefully John's determination was conveyed in his face. The young Stark still had a ways to go on making convincing speeches. A deal then. Bourne decided, you shall do your best to learn from the great shepherd. In turn, I'll teach you everything I can about Skagos and anything else you're curious about. John smiled and grabbed his own fishing pole. It's a deal then. The two cast their lines into the water and spent a calm afternoon speaking while piling a small bounty of fish into their basket. With a good haul in tow, they walked back to Stoneheart. Pulling together his nerves, John broached the subject with Torrin later that night. To John's dismay, the great shepherd's first reaction was to deride Bourne's skills. Not in plain terms, but the older man spent a good chunk of their evening pointing out his son's inexperience and lack of green seer strength, as if those were the only reasons John could possibly want Bourne's company for. Holding back his irritation, John remained steadfast in his desire. Torrin had no choice but to accept. John may have been Wolf Tongue's ward, but as the son of the Warden of the North, his wishes had influence behind them. Duties divided and arguments settled for the moment, John immersed himself in life on Skagos. // Six months sped by. For every 2 weeks spent in Stoneheart, John now spent a week with Bourne exploring Skagos. Bourne taught John how to build shelters out of bark and branches, find water using moss and to light fires with ropes and leaves. He became a deft hand with a snare and began recognizing certain herbs on sight. They would return to Stoneheart relaxed and in good spirits, only to be separated by Torrin monopolizing John's time or Bourne being called away by duty. Despite the great shepherd's lack of attention, the rest of Skagos had apparently taken notice of John's cousin. John's tutelage in the ways of the shepherds began increasing in complexity and seriousness. Caring for the weirwoods was a rather lenient process. The heart trees themselves were hardy and required very little attention. It was the rest of the woods that required care, culling plants that threatened to overtake the soil, rooting out any animals if they threatened to overpopulate a grove. It became apparent that a shepherd's duty to the werewoods was split between the woods themselves and their visitors. Hours of walking from tree to village brought on hours of stories, tales, and songs that all carried important lessons. Rhymes about which plants to mix to seal a wound, songs about how to ease a case of the shivers, even, much to John's embarrassment, a memorable story about a farmer's wife that set out the signs of pregnancy. A shepherd was expected to carry this knowledge, and while they tended to the werewood, they would tend to the people who worshipped. John wasn't particularly good at creating salves or drinks, but he grew a keen eye for noticing infection and flesh rot. His sense of smell seemed to outpace many of his seniors. Naturally, none of this was in common, and all to the islanders. After a month or two, John slipped into using Old Tongue exclusively. It was simpler to take other people's words directly rather than translate them. Though a few noted he retained a type of accent that marked him as from the mainland. Torran's insistence on mentoring John took on an unsettling paternal tone. John had no need of another father, much less one that seemed comfortable ignoring his own son. With Bourne growing ever busier on tasks from Torran, John began going out on trips and hunts alone. Often meeting another traveler or shepherd and sharing camp for a few days. All seemed to be peaceful on Skagos. The stories of stone men drifted to the back of John's mind until one frightening evening. He and Ghost had wandered west around the mountain and decided to visit one of the fishing towns on the coast. A few furs had made it through Ghost's hunts relatively undamaged, and John hoped to exchange them for some bread. He'd come into a village later than he would have liked. The sun already slipped past the horizon. The main hall doors occupied by dining townsfolk were shoved open right into his face, sending him stumbling. Followed by a grown man tripping over him and falling to the ground. The gloom of the evening and the man's drunken slurs rapidly escalated the situation. Before John could get a word out, he took a punch to the jaw and a kick to the ribs. A backhand threw his face into a patch of rocks in the dirt and warm blood flowed from his nose. It took all of John's concentration to throw himself forward, not at his assailant but at Ghost, who had been moments away from tearing open the drunk Skagossee's throat. Tackling the wolf only brought a moment's reprieve. The drunk stumbled back, but his scream drew attention from inside the hall. Half a dozen villagers streamed out towards the disturbance. In his state, John didn't want to risk Ghost going after any of them and earning their ire. He kept a firm grip on his wolf's fur and dragged the two of them into a dead sprint out of the village. He stumbled through the foliage and in between trees until his legs gave out and exhaustion washed over him. Ghost padded up and rolled him onto his back. John saw the moon steadily rising behind a branch of red leaves above him as the throbbing in his skull washed his vision with black. It was the wind that woke him. A subtle scent of blooms and sap, familiar enough to draw John from his foggy dreams. His left side was smothered underneath Ghost's weight, giving him an excuse to stay on his back as the world came into focus. John grimaced as he registered the hard crust of blood on his cheek and jaw. A heart tree stood over him and John made a small prayer, thankful that his blind escape led him to a patch of werewoods. With a heave, John pulled himself out from under Ghost and sat up. Taking a hard look around, he noticed his bags were still looped around his elbow. There was also someone kneeling in front of him. With a shout, he scrambled back and pressed himself against the werewood trunk. In his haste, he slammed a hand down onto yet more rocks, and for the second time in 2 days, his skin tore open. In the blink of an eye, Ghost was in front of the intruder. Hackles raised and teeth bared. The adolescent direwolf appeared to have no impact on the stranger. John leaned to the right to get a better look at them, his eyes widened and his jaw went slack. Kneeling before them was a small creature. Its skin rough and dark green, murky yellow eyes surrounded bright pupils that shifted as the light streamed through the tree boughs. John's mind drudged up one impression: a child of the forest sat before him, a creature out of legend. The child moved first. It tipped its head back, a mantle of leaves ran along its scalp. From the pointed mouth, there came a strange trilling sound. John could only compare it to a mixture of a bird's song and an elk's cry. The child's song echoed through the grove. Ghost's hackles lowered and lowered until the direwolf was laid out on the ground. John's face felt numb and his body tingled, muscles and fingers refused to twitch. The child stood up. They were tiny, smaller than even Arya. Two split gold pupils focused intently on the drops of blood falling from John's palm to the weirwood roots. It walked forward unafraid. The concept that John may attack did not cross its mind. With confidence, the child reached into a small moss pouch tied to its waist. Two of its fingers came out covered in what John recognized as weirwood paste. The paste was meticulously rubbed into his hand and his forehead. It stung his palm, but the cut sealed. Very carefully John swallowed and with great effort, tilted his head down. "You have my thanks," he said. The child made a point of looking at the roots as the blood he'd spilled disappeared into the bark cracks. John sat in silence, too tired to bother standing. He watched the child back away, turn and climb into the branches of another weirwood. Its body slipped between the leaves and knots, blending with foliage until it disappeared from John's sight. It took an hour to muster up the strength to start off home. John was fortunate a passing farmer recognized him. Taking the trip back to Stoneheart on a cart was more comfortable than hiking. Unfortunately, his headache returned with a vengeance when Torrin and Bourne got a look at him. In a rare example of cooperation, the two men agreed that John was forbidden from traveling on his own. 2 days of silence and remedial lessons was his punishment, to truly let the consequences set in. The rest of John's year passed quickly. He was never bored, and though Skagos was small there was always work to be done. Forward slash 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 forward slash. 2 months into the new year, Stoneheart buzzed with activity. Torrin had announced that Bourne's sister, Marie, was finally returning from her pilgrimage to the Isle of Faces. Now dubbed Skytongue, the entire valley and most of the nearby hamlets were pulled into a grand celebration. Their first true meeting was in private. John let Ghost off to hunt in the nearby field before the Stoneheart was filled to the brim with guests. "John," Torrin called from the main house, "come, it's time you met Mary properly." His host had been smiling non-stop since the Raven arrived the week before. Any humbleness from Bourne was non-existent in his sister. She sailed home with bright sails and well-tailored clothes, necklaces of teeth and feathers draped across her shoulders and wrists. Reams of soft brown hair fell to bright amber eyes that complemented her soft features. She shared very little with Arya, John thought, and his little sister was the only woman anyone had ever called Stark-like. He wondered if she resembled the late Lyanna, but tomb statues were not known for their accuracy. She wasn't tall but neither short, and Bourne mentioned she was of age with John and Rob. Above all, her presence filled the room, an assured confidence flowed from every word and gesture, contrasted with John's timorous and awkward manners. John fell back into honed instincts. He took her hand, bowed and brushed his lips across her knuckles. "Lady Mary," he greeted. Happy his voice hadn't faltered. She smiled, seemingly pleased at his courtesy. "Lord John, a true honor," she replied. "How has your stay on Skagos been?" "Different," he answered. "We're a long way from Winterfell. It's taken some time to adjust, but the island has its own charms." Myra nodded in agreement. "I felt the same way about the Riverlands. The differences were jarring, but eventually its better qualities shone through." They exchanged small talk for a few more minutes before John excused himself. There were certainly enough guests eager to speak with Marie that John's absence was quickly filled. Skytongue spent the next 2 weeks socializing, accepting gifts and giving out her own blessings. Bourne had mentioned that Marie was considered a prodigy, but to see such a young woman have praise after praise heaped upon her was astonishing. Marie's own talents were very obvious. Torrin had insisted that John should accompany her to pray one morning. The weirwood grove brightened, John thought, in her presence. Marie kneeled before the heart tree and left her body. As he did for Bourne, John watched over Marie. Her return coincided with the arrival of 3 crows. They perched on Marie's shoulders and hands, cawing to her. John suspected that the trio of crows was linked to Marie's status. More than a few shepherds stopped to stare when she took the crows out for some exercise. Marie was experienced, John concluded. She'd seen a fair share of the outside world. By all accounts, she was similar to Bourne in skills. In fact, the major difference between them appeared to be Bourne's lack of affinity for warging and dreaming, making Torrin Wolftongue's insistence that Marie takes over John's tutelage all the more confusing. After John's refusal, Torren then changed his wish. Marie should accompany John on a visit to Basket for supplies, then John should ask Marie's advice on warging with Ghost, and on and on. It took a week of badgering for John to wrangle the truth out of his cousin. "He wants you to become interested in Marie," John Bourne stated, his attention focused on the carving in his grip. "I'm not a rock, Bourne, I guessed that much. I just can't fathom why," John returned. A crude wolf taking shape from his own block of wood. "You're a Stark, John. It's not that complicated." John slammed his tools to the ground. "It is. Why would your father want to marry his prodigious daughter to a bastard?" Bourne let out a heavy sigh. "Being the descendants of a Stark gives our family a certain, unspoken prestige. My father wasn't the only candidate considered to take on the role of the Great Shepherd. His Stark lineage helped secure his title. Many believe that same blood resulted in Marie's exceptional talents." "You already have Stark blood, why would your family need more?" John asked. In terms of relation, John and Marie were fourth cousins, so far removed from each other that John's grandparents, Rickon and Lyra, had been closer kin. "Blood that is running thin," Bourne clarified. "Marie and I are the fifth generation removed from Verena Stark. The Shepherds may acknowledge our claim to the Starks, but only to a certain point. If I had children, they likely would not receive the prestige that my father does now. However, a union between you and Marie would not only reinforce the bloodline, it would tie us directly to the male line." John sat back. Torren's grandchildren would be the grandchildren of Lord Stark, he realized. Bourne nodded. "Exactly, and when Lord Eddard eventually passes, they would be the nieces and nephews of Lord Robb." The shepherd hummed. "Alliances have been built on less." John cradled his head and covered his eyes. The stress was too much. "Do you not like my sister, John?" Bourne asked. The true problem, John was growing to like Marie very much. She was charming, passionate and never dull. The last thing John wanted out of fostering was a betrothal. Though that notion may have been naive considering Robb and Arya's letters. Marriage wasn't a choice John felt ready to make. "Is there any excuse I could use to get away for a while? I think I just need some space." John was desperate. Bourne idly picked a splinter from his palm. "A friend of mine in Basket heard the Shepherds from Flint's Finger were sending a group of children to visit kin on the island. I offered to help guide them. You could join up with us." Bourne suggested. "It'll be for a few months and I doubt Marie will have time to spare away from Stoneheart." Taking care to leave his departure to the last minute, John snuck away with Bourne. Corralling a mob of children was seemingly easier than facing a betrothal. John knew it was a delaying tactic. He only hoped that a letter back to Winterfell would solicit some advice from his father. Little did he know his plea would go unread. Lord Eddard Stark was facing his own tests far more dangerous than an ambitious suitress. To the south, Stark metal was set to be tested when dozens of small ships snuck through Iron Man's Bay, around Cape Kraken, and across the Blazewater, destined for the stony shore. Chapter 20, Catching the Scent. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. For the last decade, Ned had been unable to find any tranquil part of his castle. There were always children running around, their things cluttered up the floors, their voices filled the halls. Now his children were off in other courts, growing up away from him and Caitlin. After Sansa's birth, he'd come to terms with the inevitable separation from his children. Rationally, that should have been due to marriage and age. In his nightmares, Ned imagined Robb with a chain around his neck, Sansa stranded in a tower, and Jon's tiny body wrapped in a red shroud. Ned supposed he really had no experience with this kind of peaceful, content separation. His last family had been ripped away from him, a scar that still ached. Even Benjen's departure for the Night's Watch had caused a vicious argument only soothed by months of apologetic letters. The sheer normality of worrying about fostering and negotiating betrothals sat strangely with him. Kat had been his saving grace once again. His worries soothed with her calm words and shared anxieties. There were bright spots, Robb's survival in his first battle and budding fondness for Aelys Karstark, Sansa's dedication to her growing responsibilities and artwork, Bran's colorful letters of friends and mock jousts, Arya's ever-increasing fascination with land and animals. Even Rickon was finally overcoming his bout of loneliness at the absence of his siblings. Last but not least was Jon. the bane of Ned's heart through no fault of his own. It had been hardest of all to let Jon leave Winterfell. Ned had quietly acquiesced with Jon's wish to join the Night's Watch, hopefully delaying it as long as possible. Watching his son head south to a land and a people unknown to him was paralyzing. The first letters were such a relief, and the last year had banished many of Ned's darkest thoughts and threw his past ideas in plain view. It would have been cruel, Ned could now admit, to all but sentence Jon to life in black. A crime to take such a bright and determined soul like Lyanna's son and shackle him away from family, friends, even hope. The Night's Watch had been Benjen's solace, redemption for his younger brother's soul, but it would have broken Jon. His boy claimed to love duty, truthfully, like any other young man. He wished to be acknowledged, doubly so due to his status. Ned was still unsure of Jon's future. Time with the Shepherds could only bring change, both for Jon and their family as a whole. A cynical part of Ned, the part that had been devouring the Stark histories page after page, volume after volume, noticed how easily the Stark lineage had been pruned. Ned and Kat were now afforded the chance to spread their family branches far and wide. To cement the hold on the north that had weakened after Edwyle's death left Ned's father, Rickard, an only child. 2 generations of lone Starks may not seem perilous to 8,000 years of rulership. Still, they could have easily sown the seeds of division. Particularly with his father and mother's marriage reuniting 2 branches of the family rather than expanding it. His father had chosen to strengthen ties with the Flints after a series of succession crises had rocked the mountain clans, allowing the Dustins, Ryswells, and Boltons to form the foundation for their own alliance. Subtle things that could reverberate and grow. Perhaps if Robb was Ned's only son, he would see no consequences, but Ned's grandchildren, great-grandchildren, they would have been forced to confront it. Thinking ahead into the future was becoming one of Ned's frequent pastimes. The future he was currently focused on was his experimental expansion of the White Knife. Lord Meager Sewin oversaw the initial preparations as Castle Sewin controlled that river branch. Ned had hardly needed to explain his goals before Meager had accepted his new obligation. He fondly recalled teaching Robb and Jon about the importance of the Sewins. Robb had understandably been confused as to why the Sewins were nobility in their own right when they had less land and men than a masterly house like the Glovers. It had been critical that Robb and Jon realized there was more to vassals than their holdings or strength of arms. The loyalty and support of a smaller house could dwarf others in the right circumstances. The Sewins had served the Starks before the Laughing Wolf conquered the Crannockmen. The stewardship of the Northern White Knife gave them sole control over the flow of goods by boat down to the Bight. Their cooperation had been instrumental in the construction of the Wolf's Den. The house had thus been granted the rights of law to acknowledge their loyalty. Ned knew that Cregan Stark had relied heavily on them during his reign as Warden of the North. The Sewins even had Stark blood. They were descendants of one of Cregan's granddaughters, Argella, by way of his second son Edric. The oldest surviving record of them in the histories had been a vague note made during what he'd begun calling the Times of Brandon. The earliest period of their house's history when a seemingly endless procession of King Brandons made identifying individual authors difficult. It referred to a new trade agreement between the Stark and the Axemen near the rivers. In exchange for aid in constructing a new hall, the Axemen had agreed to hold their lands under Stark justice, their weapons forever honed and ready to answer the Magna's call. Ned suspected this formalized the Sewins into faithful vassals, or a close approximation of the concept. Robb had suggested inviting mountain clans to the castle to learn just how much of the ancient ways had survived through their own practices. Another good idea added to Ned's long list of tasks. Initial surveys of the planned route proved promising. The proposed path of the extension was across relatively flat ground with little dense forest to remove. Several smaller streams could be diverted to provide extra water. Next, he contacted Roanish architects through the Iron Bank. Braavos was the only free city Ned could morally do business with, and the bankers were nothing if not inquisitive. An increase in his house's yearly deposits in exchange for a meeting and contract mediation smoothed things over. After months, Ned's representative, Veon's cousin Bolon Poole, met with a trio of Roanish architects and began working from the comforts of a small estate in White Harbor. With their expertise, Ned simply needed the materials and the labor to put his plan into action. That brought him to the letter bearing the royal seal of the Baratheon dynasty and the eagle of House Arryn. Greetings Lord Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North, from Lord Jon Arryn, Keeper of the Gates of the Moon, Lord of the Eyrie, Defender of the Vale, Warden of the East, and Hand of the King. I cannot describe the joy I felt when receiving the news of your household's good health and fortunes. Too long has there been silence between us, for I look back upon your fostering in the Vale with ever-growing fondness. Unquestionably the old gods and new have blessed us for this opportunity to unite our houses in common purpose and friendship once again. I write to you in consideration of your previous letter on the Crown's outstanding obligation to the North. Your loan was both generous and vital to the establishment of King Robert's rule. Unfortunately, the Crown was not able to repay that debt before now. Your proposal, however, was warmly received by both His Grace and the small council. Few within our kingdom can forget the bravery of your people during the Greyjoy Rebellion. As such, I found little opposition to rewarding the North with both labor and materials in the name of King Robert. In fact, many commented on the foresightedness of your wish to enrich your lands. The Crown has decreed that a force of 200 laborers shall be sent north upon the beginning of this grand project. Accompanied by shipments of food provided by House Lannister, equipment supplied by House Baratheon of Storm's End, and followed by ships of materials from House Arryn. These laborers shall be placed under House Stark's discretion, and 2/3 RDS of their pay shall be repaid by the Crown. Many of us hope to see the fruits of House Stark's labor in full. I am obliged to mention that His Grace has declared himself and select members of the small council to accompany the laborers. King Robert would be honored to be the first member of his dynasty to visit his staunch allies in the north. We await your response to finalize our plans and routes. Such a journey appears daunting, but the opportunity to reunite with you lightens the burden. I shall endeavor to bring along my own family so that our wives may have the same pleasure. It shall do my old soul good to speak with you in person and to see my foster sons together again. Always your ally. Keeper of the Gates of the Moon, Lord of the Eyrie, Defender of the Vale, Warden of the East and Hand of the King. Lord Jon Arryn. Ned reread the letter several times. It was a comfort to see Jon Arryn's writing after so long. They'd exchanged only a handful of missives since the end of the Greyjoy Rebellion. His foster father still retained a masterful skill of hiding truths within polite words, a skill Ned had never taken to. The most straightforward statements needed to be deciphered for their deeper meaning, a task Ned now found much easier after hours reading over Cregan Stark's personal letters. Your loan was generous. Unfortunately, the Crown was not able to repay, before now. The gold Robert had desperately needed to stabilize the kingdoms upon his ascension had come from a few select sources. There were castles to repair, small folk to feed, nobles to reward, not to mention the rebuilding of King's Landing. Ned knew that Jon and Robert were reluctant to extract it from the rebellious houses considering House Baratheon's own precarious position. The North had lost men but suffered little else, and his people found it fitting to support the man who helped depose the Targaryens. The loan had been generous, but Ned had ensured it could remain unpaid and not undermine the North. If the Crown was jumping at the chance to provide alternate compensation, then their treasury must be suspect. The additional, non-monetary, support from House Lannister and Baratheon hinted the state of the royal coffers may be dire indeed. Robert also planned to visit Winterfell, and by the sound of it dragging his hand along too. Ned could use some advice for moving forward, and Jon Arryn had never steered him wrong. He'd asked Cat to write to Lysa. His young nephew, Robin, should have the chance to meet his aunt and cousins. Perhaps she could even convince Lord Hoster to make the trip. A man should know his grandchildren, especially one with Hoster's fragile constitution. Planning for a royal visit in the future was a pleasant break from his usual duties. Any enjoyment for Ned was drained as a batch of urgent messages arrived. Firstly by Raven and then by courier. Sightings of bandits were rampant in the Stony Shore. Merchants from the Rills reported burnt villages and butchered livestock. At the same time, the Glovers had repelled a smaller band that fled back towards Sea Dragon Point. It was rare for more than one band of these brigands to exist nearby. They tended to spread out to avoid squabbling over resources. Penning a quick response asking Lord Ryswell for more information, Ned retreated to his solar. Brushing aside a stack of tax summaries, Ned pulled forward one of the most valuable histories, the Winter Kingdoms. An intensive document penned by Torrhen Stark's uncle, Buthel. It took great pains to track the fates of various former kingdoms after the North was united. Ned dived into the pages, past the thick sections on the early wars with the Umbers and negotiations with House Dustin. The Boltons on their own made up nearly a quarter of the tome. Near the back of the book was a heading and rough sketch of the stony shore. Before Bourne's arrival, Ned's knowledge of the shore was quite general. He knew that House Fisher had ruled as kings of the shore until House Stark subjugated them following the defeat of the Warg Kings. House Fisher had remained as a prominent masterly house along the coast. Sadly, the family was wiped out by the Ironborn during the reign of Harag Hor, whose son Ravos the Raper had used Bear Island as a base for his reaving. Ned now knew that Theon Stark had used the newly stolen knowledge of steel to drive them back to the Iron Islands. The book included some other minor details. The Fishers had retained their noble titles by offering the Starks their knowledge of sailing and shipbuilding. They had never held anything close to the naval power of the modern Mandaelis, but for the time, House Fisher had kept the western coast under watch. Buthel Stark stressed that in the wake of the Ironborn's defeat, King Theon turned his attention to plans of invading the Vale, a foolhardy endeavor in Buthel's opinion. Theon was wary of awarding any of his vassals more power after the Ryder uprising. In the absence of the Fishers, no new master of the shore was appointed. The shore's small population, decimated further by reavers, didn't hold enough sway for any family to seize power. From the time of Theon, the shore was ruled by small local families who commanded a handful of fishing villages and hamlets each. Buthel named the most prominent houses as Bloat, Trum, and Pole, but these were unfamiliar to Ned. Doubtlessly, the power had shifted over the long years. House Riswell would have more up-to-date information on the area's affairs. Typically, Ned would have left this matter to the closest vassals, in this case, Lord Riswell and Glover, but with his sons Gon and Sangza and Rukon under Caitlyn's care, he could set out to deal with the situation personally. It also provided the perfect excuse to meet nobles in the Barrowlands and Rills. Out of courtesy and obligation, the two areas had been left to their own devices. Yet, if Ned's hopes for the future were realized, the groundwork for Dustin and Riswell cooperation needed to be laid. That was easier said than done. Lady Barbary Dustin nee Riswell kept a close relationship with her home. Her personal distaste for Ned was a prevalent whisper among the nobles. Regardless, bridges must be mended, and if they were burnt beyond repair, new ones built. // In a few short weeks, supplies and an escort were assembled. Ned bid his family goodbye, promised he'd return safely, and set out upon the King's Road with a force of warriors at his back. It would have been improper to demand House Riswell or Glover put only their own men at risk to drive off these bandits. Riding alongside Ned was more in all his fearsome glory, Sir Roderick, Lord Major Sewin, and two newly sworn swords from House Argyll, Brash Orin and his brother Dans. Out of fear for Jon's safety, Ned had avoided bringing anyone but the most loyal men into Winterfell service since the rebellion. It had placed an undue burden upon young Jory Castle and Sir Roderick. Sangza's celebration had been the perfect opportunity to approach a few smaller houses and suggest they present candidates to enter his service. House Argyll had earned their lands for prowess during the rebellion, Orin and Don's uncle had even been by Ned's side during the Battle of the Bells. Their modest hall, Pitchwall, was north of Winterfell near the King's Road. They were young but eager to prove themselves. Ned had called 80 men-at-arms and 40 horsemen to muster. Enough to impress upon his vassals his own commitment and remind them that House Stark could fund a sizable force with ease. There were enough soldiers left to keep their borders safe and Winterfell guarded. The journey to the Barrowlands was smooth. Generous small folk shared their fires, and the houses along the way were all too eager to make a favorable impression. Ned had little to fear for his men's conduct. They were few enough that well-placed captains kept order. The familiar lands of Winterfell gave way to vast flat plains and huge swathes of grass. Large herds of livestock began to dot the landscape when they entered the ancestral holdings of the Barrow Kings. Past the mounds and ancient battlefields, the sound of the Salt Spear tributary forewarned the walls of Barrowtown. Unmistakable from any other in the north. Massive barns and pens marked out the town's sheer size. The various gates were swarming with people going about their business. Ned had been taught that Barrowtown was the largest livestock market in their kingdom. from pork to beef and everything in between. If any larger farmsteads had extra animals to sell, they were quickly sent on to Barrowtown, where houses from all parts would buy. Some dozen years ago, House Stark had purchased 24 cows and a bull after a bout of disease had decimated Winterfell's farms. Murmurs swept through the crowds as the Stark banner and the column of soldiers approached to be met by an escort of men in Dustin livery. Ned directed his force to set up camp while his retinue was led to the town center. Barrow Hall was set deep within the town, its back pressed to the shore. Reminiscent of the ancient style despite its reconstruction a century before Aegon's conquest. Sturdy wooden walls had been built around the old stone keep, to separate its grounds from the town proper. 4 stout towers with their own enclosed courtyards peeked over the fortifications, sparsely manned at the moment but judging from the murder holes and windows, they could each hold 3 or 4 dozen men. A bank of thick elms bracketed the perimeter, adding a subtle layer of protection. The most apparent defense was the sheer scale of the hill the castle was built upon. The great barrow towered over the walls and loomed across the horizon. Ned had only ever seen it from a distance. This would be his first time actually staying within Barrow Hall. Appropriately, Lady Dustin herself was awaiting them at the entrance to her castle. The last time they'd met had been at a harvest feast after Rooken's birth. The Lady of Barrowtown had been excruciatingly polite, then avoided any contact for the rest of the celebration. Behind her, the crown of the Dustins, quartered with Barbry's golden horsehead sigil, flew over the courtyard. Barbry was dressed in a finely embroidered dress with a high collar covered by a dark yellow shawl. Tall as always, not a hint of apprehension in her posture, Barbry cut a striking, regal figure. Ned could easily see why many had considered her a candidate for Lady of Winterfell. Her tenure as ruler of the Barrowlands proved she had the skill necessary to manage a realm. He'd feared for her in the years following the rebellion. In the name of his friend, her husband, Willam Dustin, Ned had held fast to Barbry's claim to the seat under the widow's law. Despite a handful of subtle suggestions otherwise. Those disingenuous whispers disappeared shortly after. Ned dismounted his steed and smoothly bowed to his host, Lady Dustin, my thanks for your hospitality. Barbry nodded with her own, deeper, bow, then gestured to a servant holding a platter of bread and salt. She waited for him to eat before stepping forward. My Lord Stark, you are welcome to Barrow Hall. Moore drew stares like a naked priest but had kept to Ned's side. He was quickly introduced to her steward, master-at-arms, and head maid. Noticeably absent was a maester, meaning the rumors were true. Taking a risk, Ned spoke up, is there a shepherd within Barrow Hall, my lady? Barbry kept her reaction down to a subtle twitch. Our shepherds have their own hall on the other side of the Great Barrow, Lord Stark. They are typically occupied after sunset. I'd recommend seeking their counsel around midday. Ned nodded, ordering Moore to rest near the dog pens, and their group moved into the castle proper. It might have been considered quaint compared to the grand halls of other keeps. In Ned's opinion, that was a mistake. Barrow Hall had no vaulted ceilings or great halls. Tight corridors led to modest chambers, household members fluttering from room to room busy at work. Any plain stonework or dusty floors were covered by reams of beautiful tapestries. Colorful threads burst from every corner, depicting battles, victories, hunts, and dozens of idyllic scenes, farmers at work, sheep grazing, snow-covered forests, and ice-encased lakes. Ned had to refrain from gawking at a select few tremendous pieces. The wealth of the Barrowlands was on display. The sheer amount of dyed wool and craft in these tapestries was the culmination of House Dustin's ancient rule. Promptly, Ned and Lord Sewin were seated in a warm dining room. Sir Roderick and the Argyll brothers remained outside, arranging for fresh supplies at the market. Barbry joined them for a cup of warm wine. The three awkwardly exchanged pleasantries. Barbry's grievances with Brandon were understandable, but he knew it was Willam's death that had cemented the rift between her and House Stark. Logically, Ned should have been aiming to remove her from her position. Leaving a vassal to nurse their grudge unimpeded was foolish. Nonetheless, he was wary of disrupting her rule. The shift would be detrimental to the political balance of the Greater North. Even during a mild winter, the Barrowlands' wide plains supported hundreds of herds with grazing land. They exported much-needed wool, hemp, and other fabrics, allowing the North to avoid over-reliance on the southern kingdoms for many essential goods. All that omitted the fact that Barbary had the support of her father. Lord Risswell backed her to the hilt. Any attempt to shift her out of power would alienate two major houses, and their close connection to the Boltons couldn't be ignored. Ned resolved to breach his main topic for the visit. Hesitation would get him nowhere. It's comforting to hear you are in good health. I hope you'll forgive my impropriety, but I want to broach a sensitive subject with you. Ned began. Barbary curled a fist around her goblet and sat back in her chair. Please, speak your mind, my lord. You and I know that you will not remarry. His first statement drew out a frown. The Dustin bloodline is thin, and you have not declared a successor. From Ned's short time with Willam during the rebellion he knew that a subtle but warm affection had flourished with his wife. Barbary's grief at his death had not been a ruse. To bring it up now of all times, particularly in matters of succession, was crossing a boundary. Barbary left her wine untouched, preferring to glare at Ned. Impropriety was an understatement. You walk into my hall and then seek to question my rule. Ned shook his head. Your rule is not in question. We are mortals, Lady Dustin. Our souls will be called by the old gods one day. The future of the North must be secured. No Stark shall dictate the next barrow keeper. Barbary declared. Ned took a deep breath. He'd made a misstep. I will dictate nothing. What I wish for, Lady Dustin, is for you to inform me who shall take up Willam's role after you, he declared. Barbary calmed herself, frowning at the silent Lord Sewin. She took a quick sip to clear her throat. The Dustin line was thin even before Willam took up his lordship. Apart from a scant few marriages to the local minor houses, my mother was from an older branch. Unless we wish to begin looking to the days of Cregan Stark, my brothers and I are the presumed heirs. Ned noted that Domeric Bolton, heir to the Dread Fort, carried the same claim through his late mother, Barbary's sister Bethany. I've spoken with my father. My younger brother, Ricard, has unofficially been chosen as my heir. Barbary informed him. Will the houses accept a Risswell taking the Dustin name in truth instead of through marriage? Ned asked. There is a difference between the respect earned through your years of rule and an untested son. It is a concern of mine as well. Roderick is almost of marriageable age. I've arranged for him to join me here next year. He shall take up duties in the castle and eventually act in my stead. Once the lords and ladies become comfortable with him, I have no doubt that a betrothal will swiftly follow. When a match is made, send word to Winterfell so my support can be announced, Ned added. Barbary bowed in her seat. Everyone relaxed as the door topics were sorted. Arrangements were made for their chambers and dinner. Ned stood to leave and check in on his soldiers. Lady Barbary escorted him back to the entrance. Ned stopped before the doors, taking a deep breath of crisp air tinged by livestock. Lady Dustin, it has not escaped my notice that you have a contrary opinion on Maestus. I won't assume your reasons, but it strikes me as odd that there are shepherds within your walls. Barbary looked out across the courtyard, observing her subjects. A Maestus' first loyalty will always be to their chain, it's an easy tell. They see too much, hear too much, and I find their counsel lacking at the best of times. Polite words. If they were more familiar, Ned wondered how much more she would say. Ned's own experience with Lewin spoke otherwise. His vague memories of his father's Maester, Wallers, crept up from the past. A Maester takes no wife and holds no lands, Barbary continued. At best, they are treated as an advisor, an unwanted servant at worst. The perfect conditions to craft duplicitous, bitter men. Shepherds, however. It's easy to keep a shepherd loyal. The Dustins had it perfected. You provide their parents with a gift, ensure their siblings are well taken care of. When they reach the right age, you introduce them to a few men or women and officiate the marriage not long after. Their children grow to know you as a figure of respect and the cycle repeats. Ned frowned. It was undoubtedly a cynical approach. It spoke of a wariness Ned had glimpsed in his own lines writing. Perhaps cold on the surface, but House Dustin had always asserted they were the successors to the Barrow Kings, the dynasty that claimed to have once been ruler of all first men. The crown on their sigil remained for a reason. Indeed, was Bourne's blood connection to him any different? An assurance, a link. If fate had been different. If Verena Stark had not married a shepherd, would Bourne's father have become the Great Shepherd? Would his replacement have reached out? The Barrowtown Shepherds also carry an important role. They are caretakers of the Great Barrow and the King's Tomb. Barbary pointed out. A daunting task. I imagine keeping spirits content would be. I don't know the specifics of their rites. Part of Ricard's tutoring will be instruction in the Dustin traditions, so their history will not be lost, Barbary commented. Ned tugged his surcoat straight. I thank you again for hosting us. We shall depart tomorrow for the Rills and hopefully put this bandit threat to rest. Oh. Barbary quipped, do you assume my family is incapable of handling these outlaws on their own? A plain insinuation, that tone of anger had seeped back into her voice. Ned truly had to be more considerate with his words around her. He was not used to his comments being taken with anything other than honest intention. Staying cloistered in Winterfell had spoiled him. Ned smiled, on the contrary, I shall be relying on Ryswell prowess in the coming battle. I doubt these thieves will last long against a charge by the Red Rider. Forward slash 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 forward slash. A filling dinner, some pleasant conversation with Barbary's household, and relaxing sleep. Ned felt refreshed the following day. Taking care to leave enough time for a visit to the Great Barrow around midday, Ned ordered Sir Roderick make ready to march. The castle was built along one face of the mound. At the western edge, a gated path cut into the slope, leading around to the backside of the barrow. Overlooking the salt spear was the dense godswood, with trees as ancient as Winterfell's. Rather than spread out as in his home, Ned walked between the tightly pressed boughs. The weirwoods were so thick and knotted, they carpeted the ground. Moore was carefully picking his way between them while scenting the air. The heartree was harder to find. It didn't tower over the rest of the grove. A cleared path led Ned to the base of the barrow. Set into a sunken circle, a thick weirwood with an imposing face nestled into the soil. A strained grin and squinted eyes looked out into the world, the expression was rictus. Ned would compare it to the expression of wounded men on the battlefield who felt death creeping into their bones. Its trunk wasn't exceptionally tall. The lowest branches skimmed Ned's scalp. Its growth seemed to have been focused on its roots. They spiraled outward and crept over the edge of the pit, like hands grasping for air. Swathes of moss enclosed the topmost layer, leaving the root system's underside to fold back in and on itself, mimicking a frozen wave caught in the moment of its churning. Stopping the heartree's expansive growth was a row of knee-high poles. The roots had obviously reached them at some point and wound up to the flat tops, forming a mesmerizing knot pattern. He knelt on one knee and began a silent prayer. Ned was interrupted by Moore's bark. He'd been so concentrated he'd missed the slabs of stone set into the mound side. Two straight rocks supported a crossbeam, creating an opening to a tunnel. A lantern pole stood under them. Ned's heartbeat sped up. The thump of feet filtered through the background noise, a subtle waft of sweat and oil. A figure in green robes with familiar cords of teeth and claws stepped out of the dark into the godswood. They wore a whitewood mask, different from Bourne's. Rather than an expressive face with clear eye holes and a crest adornment. The Barrow Shepherd, at least that was Ned's best guess, had no mouth, a tiny bulge over the nose, and two slits for eyes. Old tongue was carved in a circle from the forehead, around the eyes, connecting on the chin. Feg magna hoif /odlas ken en ban /herald duffith. The king sleeps, earned in death, kept by words Ned read. The shepherd stopped mid-step before retreating slightly. Their head snapped back and forth once, twice. Ned wasn't sure if they were wary of Moore or him. He decided to make an overture. My apologies, shepherd. I simply came to pray, he said in old tongue. You are welcome, Magna. Magna Dustin informed me of your arrival, the shepherd responded in soft tones muffled by the mask. I would only ask that you keep it brief. Your presence here may cause some disturbances. Ned frowned, squinting at the shepherd. It was an odd warning. There was no one else in the grove. Moore barked once again, stepping in between the two of them. More, Ned scolded. The shepherd shuffled to the right, out of the archway in the sunlight proper. Moore's attention remained fixed on the black tunnel. Ned squinted. It wasn't completely dark. A faint light flickered deep inside the passageway. Hues of blue and white entranced him. Ned's hand reached out and rested on the lantern pole. He blinked. When had he taken so many steps? He was at the edge of the tunnel, the stone arch pressing down on him. A shout from behind went ignored as Ned prepared to enter. The light was there, it was so strange, so alluring. For a brief second, Ned thought he heard someone calling him. Was it Liak? Was it Brandon? Was it Ashura? A jaw closed around the trail of his cloak and yanked him back. Ned stumbled and crashed to his back. His face was soaked with sweat, and his head pounded. More dragged him further from the tunnel, and the shepherd leaped forward. They reached into a small sack resting against the lantern pole and pulled out a dozen tree branches, fir trees judging by the needles. The shepherd squared their shoulders, walked forward, and began repeating a lyrical prayer while tossing the fir branches onto the ground. They took care to crush each branch with their foot before dropping the next one. The light retreated farther and farther into the barrow, disappearing completely around some unseen corner. Ned heaved back to his feet, rubbing more after wiping his forehead. He turned to the shepherd, who had finally come within arm's reach. "You mentioned a disturbance," Ned stated. The shepherd rubbed their hand together. "Yes, Magna Stark. The Great Barrow." They paused. "It is a special place. There is power here." The tomb of the first king was shrouded in mystery. Ned knew its secrets were a combination of dust in tradition and warped ancient stories. Bourne's analysis of the oldest Winterfell tomes suggested that the first king had been a legend even during the Builders' time. Northern sources depicted the king as leading the first men across the Riverlands and the Neck but made no mention of crossing from Essos. Lewin proposed that the first king was separate from Garth Greenhand, but perhaps the two were not mutually exclusive. After all, Greenhand was said to have been the High King of the First Men. Powerful rivals would have chafed against that title. "I've never seen anything like that in the crypts of Winterfell." "Perhaps not," the shepherd agreed. "I really shouldn't say any more, Magna. Places of the dead, especially places of legacy, have a power all their own. They're not all as active as the Great Barrow, but that's a good thing, in my opinion." The shepherd was obviously reticent to speak. Ned had gone beyond what was proper. "In any case, you have my gratitude for your aid," Ned added. "May the old gods watch over you, Magna Stark." The shepherd departed for another path on the opposite side of the Heartree, hurrying but not quite running. Checking one last time that Moore had calmed, Ned took his wolf and left. He had other matters to attend to, but this experience should be noted. Between his accounts of the rebellion and invading the Iron Islands, this strange encounter would fit nicely into Ned's own book. Something rests beneath the Great Barrow, and it does not suffer rivals. Beware the fell lights and trust in the watchers. Places of the dead have a power all their own. // Notes. Writing Ned is so easy. I swear this chapter was only supposed to be 3,000 or so words, but great things kept slipping out. Barbary is a very interesting character, and considering the small power block she's connected to, Ryswell, Dustin, Bolton, I think it makes sense how big a player she became in canon. Barrowtown is also a very cool place in my opinion. Just a note that there are some inconsistencies in older chapters that I don't know if I'll ever get around to fixing, but just as a heads up, during Sansa's most recent chapter, Chapter 14, I mistakenly have born as still in Winterfell. It was meant to be Old Nan playing with Rickon in the Godswood. We're going to be jumping back and forth between Ned and Jon for the next bit as both men face new challenges. I'm reaching what I think is the midway point of the story. I'm starting to think about having some major time skips after this arc is done, but I have to iron out if I want this story to be split with a sequel or just keep going. As always, see and see appreciated. Chapter 21, Beyond Your Name, Lies Glory. Chapter text. Jon. Jon. Where's Ghost? Jon looked up from his satchel. Basket's market was barely filled this early in the morning, most visitors wouldn't arrive for another hour. Calling to him was a trio of women. Out front was a young girl, around Arya's age, excitedly skipping. Holding her hands were two older girls with identical faces. "I'm sorry, Giz. Ghost is back at Stoneheart," John explained. Bourne needed his help, some squirrels got stuck in the grain larder. Giz frowned, the young girl positively adored the direwolf. Unlike some of the other children on the island, she didn't have the sense to be wary of his fangs. Giz's older sisters, the twins Yuzil and Wimmer, shared a look. Yuzil leaned down, and in a quiet tone, asked, "If you don't mind the interruption, John, we wanted to ask a favor from you." John ensured the dried meats were properly wrapped, tied the sack closed. "How can I help?" "We hoped you could pass along word to Myra," Wimmer explained. John bit back a grimace. 2 years on Skagos, a full year since Marie's return, John's friendship with the woman was congenial, and it was fair to say he was fond of her, but Wolf-Tongue's meddling had stretched his patience. Going off on errands and trips with Bourne had done the trick for a while. Torrin himself had been called to an emergency in Bolton Lands for a few months, taking Marie with him, earning more reprieve. Now though, John suspected Torrin had reached the end of his rope. John and Marie were both 5 and 10, a betrothal would be acceptable, and in another 5 or 6 years they would both be in a position for marriage. Back to the present, John inquired, "Of course, what do you wish me to tell her?" Giz grabbed onto his sleeve. "We want her to come visit us," the girl pleaded. Yuzil rubbed her hands together. "We'd appreciate a visit. We haven't seen her for more than an hour in passing since she returned." Wimmer, the more confident twin, scowled. "If she's decided we're not worth her time, she should tell us in person." "I didn't know you were friends with Marie," John said. Wimmer scoffed. "Maybe we aren't." "Don't say that." Yuzilla scolded her sister. Giz ignored the brewing argument and leaned against John. "I miss her," Giz confessed. Now that John thought of it, Marie had never struck him as antisocial. She was confident and poised. He had seen her visiting plenty of people. Only, those had been made on the behalf of her father, to adults and elders. John couldn't think of time she'd even taken a true leave from her duties. He didn't spend every moment of the day with her. It was possible Marie simply found time for her own interests when he wasn't around. What was it Bourne had told him those years ago in Winterfell? "There's a good chance she'll be the great shepherd one day," Bourne had said. John smiled at the trio. "I'll let her know. In fact, it'll be the first thing I do when I get back." Giz smiled. "Thank you, John." Her sisters settled their argument and nodded as well. A glimmer of hope in Wimmer's eyes. He bid them goodbye and began the walk back. The route was second nature to him now, and people greeted him as they crossed paths. John barely paused while climbing the earthen steps to the entrance of Vidon. Faces set in the walls no longer frightened him. He was finally strong enough in his warging to resist their calls. John entered Stoneheart, setting the food to be organized later. He guessed that Ghost had followed Bourne down to the lake for a quick wash, leaving John and Marie alone. Wolf-Tongue was mediating a marriage for the Stain that week. Marie had mentioned she would be too busy transcribing a new text to accompany him. John knocked carefully on the door to the study. Bourne had declined retaking his room, choosing to board with Rogan's family instead. Tensions over that declaration were still taut. Wolf-Tongue seemed to accept it, but Marie had shouted herself hoarse arguing with her brother. The door opened. Marie stood on the other side. Sleep clung to her eyelids. "Can I help you, John?" she asked. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Marie shook her head, opening the door wider. No, I was taking a break." John nodded. "I was in Basket this morning. Giz and her sisters flagged me down." Marie kept a blank face, her eyes darted to her feet. She looked to be bracing herself. "What did they want?" John thought better of repeating Wimmer's comment. "Giz wanted you to visit." Marie bit her lip. "I'm sure she did. Yuzil mentioned they hadn't seen much of you since you returned from the south." John commented. Marie straightened her back and took a deep breath. "I've been busy," she said. John looked off awkwardly. "Too busy to visit your friends?" Marie took offense to that. "Don't put words in my mouth, John. You've been here, you've seen how many duties I have." Not all of us can go wandering off into the woods for weeks at a time. John was taken aback. Well, I don't see you trying to share the burden with me or Bourne. They are my responsibilities, I will deal with them. Your friends wish to see you. They asked me to pass along a message. If you're so busy, I'll let them know not to bother next time. John retorted. Marie dug her fingernails into the doorframe. I would very much like to see them. Duty prevents me. I have meetings to make, people to speak with. I don't have the luxury of being father's lazy ward. John leaned forward. Bourne finds plenty of time for people outside of Stoneheart. Bourne has chosen a different kind of life. Chosen? John growled. Bourne does not choose to be ignored by Wolf Tongue like the scraps off his table. He didn't choose to be ignored by the elders here. He certainly never chose to be treated second best to you, as if it's somehow his fault that he doesn't meet the standards of your family. If you asked him for help, if you just suggested it, he would bend over backwards to be there for you. Marie shoved John back out of the threshold. Bourne has always been too scared to take my side. I have always been on my own. I have always carried father's expectations while Bourne ran off to the cliffs. He has never and will never have the spine to stand up for himself, so how can I expect him to stand up for me? Marie asked. That is unfair, John insisted, crowding forward. No, it's true. He ran away when I was born. He ran when I first dreamt. He ran when I brought home my first bird. He ran when our mother left and he only came back out of guilt. Marie shouted. Your mother? John whispered, thrown by the sudden topic. Marie composed herself. Both took a few seconds to breathe. Mother left when Bourne was small. She seldom visited and the next time she stayed was only long enough to give birth. After a year, once I was healthy, she departed again. Bourne has never forgiven her or father. I think he's never forgiven me. Marie told him. John was shocked. Bourne had never mentioned his mother. John assumed she'd passed on. He, of all people, had no desire to bring up the subject of mothers in casual conversation. Where is she? John couldn't stop himself from wondering. Marie sighed. You've met her, John. I think I would recall meeting my best friend's mother. John insisted. Marie looked fatigued. The lack of sleep was more evident in the hallway. Our mother is Nadine Bleakwing. John recalled an older woman, grey hair, typical shepherd garb, a fleshy falcon circling around her. She'd greeted them their first day on Skagos. John's next encounter had been by chance on a lone trip months later. Nadine had been polite and generous, even kind enough to lend him some extra rations for Ghost. I would never have guessed. Bourne spoke with her when we landed at Basket. He said nothing. They acted like acquaintances, nothing more. Like most of his problems, he believes that accepting and ignoring it is enough. Marie said. No matter how furious or upset he may be, he thinks that confronting her or father is pointless. He's given up. John leaned against a wall, his shoulders slumped. Bourne's fatalistic streak was apparent to anyone who truly knew him. 2 years together and John still found himself desperately dragging Bourne's confidence up from the pits he put himself in. You should visit your friends, John advised. Not, he interrupted Marie's response, out of obligation. Because it would do you good. You work very hard, Marie. You've earned a break. Even your father takes leaves. John reminded her. Marie breathed deeply, rubbed her jaw. Perhaps you're right. If Bourne and I take another trip, perhaps longer than usual, Wolf Tongue won't have a reason to keep you close by, John suggested. You've noticed it then? How desperately he's started pushing us together. Yes. I dare say everyone in Vaden knows. John quipped. Marie looked him in the eyes, a tilt on her lips. It would not be a terrible union, I think, between us. Only she hesitated. There's much I want to do in my life. Much I can do as an unattached shepherd. Marriage, especially to someone with noble blood, would complicate that. It was the strangest dismissal he'd ever heard. John had always expected he'd be rejected for a proposal unless it was carefully negotiated by his father. Being discounted for bearing a portion of Stark blood rather than accepted for it, shocked him. That's fair. John agreed. They both listened closely when the front door creaked open. "John! Are you back?" Bourne called. Marie frowned and turned back to her room, closing the door softly behind her. John moved to the entrance and smiled at the sight of a dripping ghost trying desperately to dry himself on the floor. "I'm glad I caught you," Bourne said. "A message arrived while you were gone. Something's amiss beyond the wall." John crouched by Ghost, checked his paws for any pebbles. He nodded for Bourne to continue. "A free folk shepherd came to consult with Father. There's a chieftain seeking an audience." Bourne explained. John looked up sharply. "An audience with the great shepherd? He thinks the Skagasi would let a wilderling onto the island? Or is he mad enough to think Wolf Tongue will go north?" Bourne scratched his eye. "I'm not sure. But when I asked, the shepherd said this chieftain is different. Said that he might be the next king beyond the wall." A chill ran down John's back. Stories of Joramun and Redbeard chorused from his memories, tales of dead Starks, dead Umbers and dead Night's Watchmen. No king beyond the wall had ever brought peace. They arose out of conflict between the wildlings and inevitably turned to the prosperous lands due south. The last invasion had been under the reign of William Stark, and he had died then, facing Redbeard by the Long Lake. "What will your father do?" John dared to ask. "This has never happened before. No king beyond the wall has ever sought out the great shepherd. They've had shepherds among their followers, but this is strange. Father will be cautious. If he can meet with this chieftain. I just don't know." Bourne was clueless. John didn't know what could be done. Could the great shepherd suss out this wilderling's intention? Perhaps John could send word to his father, giving the whole of the north time to prepare. What state was the Night's Watch in? Uncle Benjamin had always bemoaned the lack of men and supplies. If the tribes decided to cross the wall, House Stark and all its might needed to be mustered. Fantasies kindled in John's imagination. There would be honor and glory in such a battle. John recalled more than a few tales of wilderling clashes from the Stark histories. One had been his guilty pleasure for a few weeks before growing tired of it. It was an account of the invasion by the Twin Kings, Gendel and Gorn, who dug a tunnel beneath the wall and raided down past Last Hearth. King Alder Stark mistakenly thought he would be confronting a handful of savages who'd run ahead of their army. His small force was brutally crushed and the king was killed. The armies of Winterfell needed a true leader to hold out until the Night's Watch could meet them. According to Mayor Stillowin's lessons, his son and heir had marched and laid waste to his father's killers. The passage that shocked John was written by Alder's grandson. "My father does well to act before the Magners and their families. Every year, he holds a toast to his departed predecessor and rests his old bones in a chair, tears in his voice. In private, by the smile of the moon, he toasts his good fortunes. The good fortune that King Alder had called for his estranged brother from Oldcastle to Winterfell in secret, the good fortune that he was young enough to endear himself to King Alder's advisers and prove his skill in the yard. All good fortune, that the great shepherd herself had been visiting the castle when the survivors of Alder's cavalry returned with his body. My father met privately with the great shepherd and instead of chaos and confusion, King Jon was pronounced Alder's successor. My father drove the two-headed wildlings back to their dark homes. In the wake of such a victory, of such vengeance, few would naysay him. It just so happened that rumors spread from ear to ear that Jon was not Alder's half-brother but in fact his own son. Such claims were difficult to disprove. My father has the Stark look and House Locke had a daughter of the right age. Many still remark he is the spitting image of my great-grandfather. Cousins and other claimants retreated in face of King Jon's claim. Thus, when I was born, King Alder was my grandfather, not my late uncle. John imagined his own prowess granting him a name and title. With wilderling blood on his blade, who would dare speak out against Lord Stark rewarding his bastard son with a keep and land? Times of conflict presented an opportunity for even a bastard to rise high. I am a man grown now. In the care of the Reeds, lives my own brother. My wife is yet to conceive. In my heart, a part of my soul rests easy, knowing that if another wilderling cuts me down, the Stark name shall not falter. Though who knows if I shall feel that way when my next child is born. To be seen as an asset, a valuable member of House Stark, had marveled a 12-year-old John. With more years of experience, those old dreams soured. The very thought of a raider cutting down Father, Rob, any of his brothers, drove a spike through his heart. Glory could just as easily be one defending his kin. John Bourne called from the kitchen, "There's nothing to do but wait, come help me sort out the pantry." John rose and went to help, all the while mapping out the quickest route to the wall from Basket. He should ask Bourne to help him get a proper weapon. Less than 2 days passed. Torrin Wolftongue and a large retinue of advisers descended on Stoneheart in a rush. Hours and hours of debate followed. John paid as much attention as possible before he rested. A decision was made. A small group of shepherds would travel beyond the wall and meet this chieftain. They would speak with him and assess his character. If they found him trustworthy, he and a very small escort would be brought back to Skagos. The men and women were chosen. Eager to see the wall and the wild lands beyond it, John cajoled Torrin into allowing him to accompany the party, on the condition that Bourne acted as his guard and no one revealed John's identity. Within the week, John and Bourne met with the leader of their envoy, Shepherd Tiller, a longtime friend of Wolftongue and her 2 students Brod and Vam. A force of 20 Skagosy sailors and their vessel, Pride of Stain, would take them past Eastwatch to a safe landing near Hardham along Knifeback Shore. From there they would go west to the mouth of the Antler River and await the wildlings. When John finished stowing his packs on the ship, he finally took a moment to ask Bourne, "Who is this chieftain anyways?" "They say he was a man of the Night's Watch, a deserter. They call him Mance Raider. // Chapter 22, Gathering the Hunters. Chapter text. The thunder of hooves, typically the warning of a cavalry charge, was a common sound in the rills. On Ned's first visit, a brief stop to gather troops for their march south, he'd met Mark Riswell for the first time. The man was a few years older than him, a cousin of Lord Riswell. They'd become swift friends, and when Ned heard his first thundering, he'd startled and clumsily drew his sword. Mark had laughed so hard he nearly fell from his stirrups. Mark took deep breaths and drew Ned's attention to the wide plain west of their camp. The thunder rolled closer and closer, until a herd of horses crested the grass. It struck Ned still. 30 to 40 horses charged across the grassland. In their wake a trio of riders kept pace, 2 men and a woman in thick coats with large packs attached to their saddles. In Ned's mind, that memory encapsulated the rills. Back among the plains and streams again, Ned was unsurprised that the rolling thudding of a herd called up these images. Thoughts of Mark and the Riswells reminded Ned of the Trident. That battle had been harrowing. Dornish spears and Targaryen troops, bolstered by Rhaegar's presence, fought viciously. Ned remembered charging shield to shield with a mass of Mutin infantry. The Loyalists stalled their advance and Ned prepared to pull back. At the last moment, he saw banners in the wind. The Merman of Marndaeli, the Carstark son and the Riswell horse. With a tremendous war cry, Mark Riswell led the charge. His red cape and tabard stood out from his dark mare. The Red Riders, the soldiers named Mark and his men, for their bravery. Upon the horizon, Ned saw the tiny shape of Swift Bank, the seat of House Riswell. They'd crossed the Salt Spear 3 days ago. Steady progress and flat ground carried them far. The Rill River, like the Salt Spear, climbed up from the coast, creating a neat divide within the land. The Rill River forked into 2 ends. At the center of that split, almost cradled, was the castle. The eastern finger fed directly into Twin Drift Lakes, which marked the border of Tall Heart lands. West of the Rill River was Stony Shore proper. Their trek led them past a number of stable towns, the most prominent feature of the countryside. Often clustered around noble families, these towns and villages supported the vital studying and training traditions that permeated their land. Many of the small folk in the rills made their living this way. It was joked that rillmen could mount a stallion blindfolded, gagged, with one hand, and still ride better than a Riverlander. The sun rose behind Ned's back. Another stable town was ahead of them. A strange sight caught his eye. Beside the town was a number of rough tents forming a disorganized camp. Following the norm, a small group of small folk emerged from the town and awaited his arrival. They kneeled when Ned dismounted with Sir Roderick. Normally he'd simply ride through the town, but the camp bore investigation. Ned took in the representatives before him. They were a mix of young and old. Each wore well-made clothes, the women among them had some token pieces of jewelry and the men showed no signs of hunger. This close to the castle, the town would be sworn directly to Swift Bank. Their leader was marked by the iron chain hung around his neck. It carried a bronze disc adorned with a rearing horse in silver wire. This was the alderman, the elected speaker for this town. The man in question was older, stout with long legs, a common trait in real blood. He had a shock of thin black hair combed back against his scalp. A wide mustache stretched across his face accenting his large mouth. Ned guessed he was an experienced soldier by the worn sword at his hip. "Rise, good folk," Ned commanded. They stood and waited for the alderman to take charge. He stepped forward, a limp in his right leg, and bowed deeply. "Lord Stark, you honor us with your presence. Be welcome in Radar, our homes are open to you." The alderman's voice gave Ned pause. There was a hint of lisp in his speech. "I thank you, we shall not be here long. Our destination is Swift Bank," Ned explained. "I have some questions before I ride on." The alderman swiftly motioned his people to disperse and led Ned to a larger house near the town center. "We may talk in my home, Lord. Feel free to partake," the alderman suggested. Ned and Sir Roderick were promptly served a small platter of meat, and of course bread and salt. "First, may I ask your name, alderman? I think we've met before," Ned inquired. The alderman took off his chain insignia, carefully placed it back in a case and sat across the table. He nodded. "You do, Lord. I am Orom Stoff, sworn sword to House Riswell." "Stoff? You were one of Lord Roderick's guards during the Greyjoy Rebellion," Ned recalled. Orom had been one of several bodyguards. Lord Riswell had relied on him for several important tasks during the invasion of the Iron Islands. "You bit through your tongue while the Maestus worked on your knee. It was crushed by a Botley's hammer," Ned remembered. A hint of embarrassment crossed Orom's face. He nodded stoically. "It's true, Lord. When we returned I could no longer ride beside Lord Roderick into battle. For my long service, I was granted the ownership of the stables here. Now an alderman as well," Ned complimented. "A well-earned reward." A hint of pride straightened Orom's shoulders. "I do my best, Lord. My daughter, Sanra, is a lady-in-waiting to Lady Riswell. I hope my sons will serve Lord Roger as I did his father." Ned smiled softly and toasted. "What can you tell me about that camp in the field?" Ned asked. "Refugees. Driven east from the stony shore by brigands," Orom replied. "Strange tidings from the shore, Lord Stark. These criminals did not stop after one or two raids, they went from village to village, quickly, leaving no supplies. From what I've been told, they asked no tribute. They attacked, stole what they could carry, and marched any prisoners off. Are these slavers? I'm unsure. A few of the young ones snuck back after fleeing their homes and hid nearby. They say the brigands are using prisoners to cut down trees and bring the timber to the water. Strange, are they fools?" Sir Roderick commented. He knew as well as Ned that brigand groups typically extort villagers over time. It was better to take a sack of meat and milk every week, than to be stuck with a dead cow. "What troubles me more," Orom warned, "is their manner. There's more than one greybeard that swears they heard prayers to the drowned god on the brigand's lips." If true, that troubled Ned greatly. Ironborn raiding on any scale meant Balon Greyjoy was flaunting Robert's decrees. It could be rogue sailors from another house operating outside of their Lord Paramount's orders. Would that excuse save his ward, Theon, from the block? Was the Lord of Pike willing to risk Robert's wrath and lose his only son? Young Theon had enjoyed his time in Torrens Square, made fast friends, and unfortunately he'd made enemies too. After a brief return to Winterfell, Ned had decreed another trip, this time to White Harbor. The Mandaelis were more neutral on the topic of the Ironborn, and with the ocean open to him, Theon could gain much-needed experience with larger vessels. Lord Mandaeli had helpfully agreed to keep a close eye on Theon's leisure activities. The Greyjoy heir was growing. Ned hoped that time among others of the North would blunt his excesses and foster some good sense. No less critical was the lumber being harvested. The North had plentiful forests, the Iron Islands had none. In the days when the Ironborn ruled as kings of the isles and rivers, the riverlands provided them logs aplenty. Egon's conquest had cut the reavers off from the most essential element of their power, ship materials. The poverty of the home islands had reduced the people in a way Ned had not understood until reading of the devastation the Driftwood kings wreaked in days of old. The Iron Fleet Victorian Greyjoy led into battle at Fair Isle had been outnumbered by the Baratheon and Redwyne ships. Something unheard of in the days of King Claude the Cruel, when the Ironborn could lay claim to land from Bear Island all the way to the Ubber. Even if Balon had gained independence from the Iron Throne, he would have needed to take territory on the mainland to hold it. What good was a kingdom if all it could revel in was rock? Ned stood from the table to bid Orom farewell. "I'll inform Lord Ryswell Winterfell shall reimburse you for any supplies used to feed the refugees," he added. He and Sir Roderick reunited with Lord Sewin at the ramshackle camp. He spotted the Argyll brothers entertaining some of the young children who'd been inspecting the soldiers. Winterfell's men were ready to march on. Ned bid them wait on the edge of town. It didn't take long to spot a shepherd amongst the people, most likely from Radar as she had a loop of horsehair threaded through her mask. He asked after the health of the people and was assured they would be taken care of. Messages had begun moving along the coast between small folk and shepherds. Eyes were being set upon Blazewater Bay. The shepherd did request that Ned take the time to visit some of the wounded. With some prompting he even offered blessings and assurances to the few unlikely to survive the coming month. It was a somber task that hardened his resolve. // Noon arrived the next day when the Direwolf flag reached the walls of Swift Bank. Wider than tall, the Ryswell's castle was set among prime grazing ground and its walls encompassed a massive stable and training yards that dwarfed Winterfell's. In exchange, the actual keep was compact. Lord Roderick and his sons were genial and accommodating. Quarters for his captains were provided and space allotted to his soldiers. He clasped arms with Roderick Ryswell and smiled. While there had been tension with the house in the wake of the rebellion, Mark Ryswell, as cruel as it was to say, was not Roderick's son. Lord Roderick's prominent participation in the invasion of Pike had gone a long way to smooth relations. "Lord Stark, I welcome you to Swift Bank. These are my sons, Roger, Rickard, and Roose," Roderick introduced. The boys were close in age. Roger was around 23, Rickard 21 and Roose was 19. They shared a close resemblance with each other and their father, except for their eyes. All three had inherited the dark green eyes of their mother, Lady Kayla of House Sipel. Ned would not tarry for long and after eating, he met with Lord Roderick and Roger in private. "Refugees camped in the rills, graveyards." Speaking of Ironborn, this has spiraled out of control, Ned lamented. "I need more information, Roderick." "You'll hear no arguments from me, Eddard. When you informed me of your plans to come personally, I spared no effort in gathering more information. Roger himself began collecting messages and our Maester has been sending ravens by the dozen." Rickard motioned for his heir to speak up. Roger leaned forward, slightly hesitant in the presence of his liege lord. "Rule in the Stony Shore is minimal. Typically, a family will amass enough standing to approach either us or the Glovers and seek endorsement. The ones who receive it call themselves landed and 3 or 4 hold power at any given time. They control a handful of fishing villages and a few farms at most. Currently, there should be 4. Roderick pulled out a map of the Blazewater coast, including the Rills, Stony Shore, and Sea Dragon Point. The hooks and tills live on the southern end of the shore, closest to the coast proper. The spines and trawls cover the north in close proximity to Sea Dragon Point. Roger pointed out. "We've seen our fair share of refugees," Roderick acknowledged. "The worst news came with the first wave. All that remains of the hooks are 2 young boys, the tills have been reduced to a grandmother." Ned sat back in shock. "Our best guess is that the bandits targeted them first, which means they landed on the southern beaches," Roderick summarized. Looking back over the map, Ned spotted a marker called Lodlith Hall. It was on the border of Sea Dragon Point and the northern edge of Stony Shore, the closest place he could see to the territory of the Trolls. "Who rules there?" Ned asked. "House Gitton, beholden to the Glovers," Roger answered. "Send them a message and one to the Glovers." I want men to find the spines and trolls, make contact and garrison their villages. Ned ordered. What of your own troops? I sent riders to patrol the crossings on the rills. So far no sightings. Ned nodded at Roderick, pleased at his initiative. Do you believe these are Ironborn, my lord? Roger boldly asked. I cannot say for sure. Ned replied. What I can say is that we need to know their numbers. If there are more than I anticipated, I may need to call on Tallheart and Glover to support us. Lord Stark, Roderick repeated. If these are Ironborn, we will find proof one way or the other. If they are, I wonder if they come by orders or in defiance of the Greyjoys. Personally, I doubt the latter. The Lord of Winterfell knew what his vassal implied. Balon Greyjoy's actions would ignite a string of political trouble. Robert would be furious at such blatant disrespect. Ned would not stand for the theft of people and property. Even Tywin Lannister may involve himself if Balon was rebuilding the Iron Fleet. The old lion was not likely to forget the burning of Lannisport. Unsure and fatigued, Ned excused himself and retreated to his temporary chambers. He opened his bags and set out a handful of books and stylus. Taking care, he jotted down some thoughts from the day and any new information, then marked a reminder to investigate a solution to properly controlling the shore. Alone with his thoughts, he turned to 2 copies of the Stark histories he'd brought with him on the journey. To travel light, Ned had been careful in his selection, a condensed collection of writings by Theon Stark and the Hungry Wolf's father, Theo Stark, put together by Jon as a farewell present, and the writings of King Edric Stark, which Bourne had copied together from across 3 different books. He reached for the words of the Hungry Wolf but paused. Theon's ferocity and battle lust did not always sit well with Ned. His words came from a different time, his thoughts never strayed from the threats on his borders. Instead, Ned opened the book on Edric Stark, called Snowbeard in later life. Tradition stated that he fought wildlings, Ironborn, and slavers from the Stepstones for most of his century-long rule. Until in his old age, the slavers captured the Wolf's Den. In his own words, his kingship had been exhausting and draining. Ned flipped through some of the later entries, before King Edric's death. I cannot see but for vague shapes and colors. I cannot stand but for a few minutes. Time has worn my bones and spirits. My grandson, Brandon, writes for me now. A good boy, one who has taken heed of my lessons and my mistakes. He shall make a fine king one day. The Magners say the Wolf's Den has been captured. Captain Facey's son came to claim his vengeance. The upstart is lucky I am not 20 years younger. Else I'd ride down the white knife and kill the slaver boy like I did his father and uncles. It is my shame that I have left this burden to my sons. Benfred has taken command, king in all but name until I breathe my last. He will have no time to devote to these pirates. The Boltons are on the cusp of a blood feud with the Karstarks and our cousins require his support. After that, he or his brother Torrig must speak with the mountain clans. Magna Flint has spotted wildlings on the Bay of Ice. Their newfound love of the water must be crushed swiftly. On and on the tasks go, but we shall endure. I think back on my hesitation to eradicate the slavers in those first years. I believed that after a few losses, the scum would sail back to their dens and seek new targets. I showed restraint, to minimize the North's losses. They never stopped coming. Perhaps they saw my restraint as a weakness, an opportunity. I chose to never meet the slavers on their terms, always did I consider them lesser than even the Ironborn, and I treated them as such. In error, I believe. For these slavers have not the sense of honor to leave defeated, they did not have the sense to save their lives and ships for a more advantageous cause. Now this foolish spawn of Facey has conquered a tiny scrap of our land, with no way to keep it. All out of a mad desire for revenge, for glory. Too many stories about ancient Stepstone kings and their great fleets. He does not realize that winter will come for him. Listen well, Brandon. You must never inflate the spirit or standing of your enemies. Always be aware of their capabilities. Do not limit them to your own morals. The direwolf does not hunt a fox as though it cannot dig a burrow, or try to catch a bird as though it has no wings. People, friends and foes, will never account themselves to your own code. Do not delude yourself, speak to the false smile but always see the true face. Edric would pass on some months later. His grandson, Brandon Isize, would retake the Wolf's Den and end the line of Vassar. Ned put away the book. If these were Ironborn, true Ironborn raiders, here under the orders of Balon Greyjoy, he must consider that Balon, despite all logic, considered Theon an acceptable loss. Following that thread, it meant there was nothing keeping the Lord Reaper from rebuilding his navy. Strangely, that meant Theon was more valuable than ever. The entire point of his wardship was to have a friendly lord take up the seat on Pike. Did Balon learn nothing from his first defeat? Did he know something, see something Ned couldn't? Or was he so driven by his old ways that all reason had escaped him? Did the lords under him think the same? What was it about those Barren Isles that drove its rulers to such ambition? Ned could lose himself in these circling thoughts. Answers would not appear from thin air. He needed information. Another message, to be sent to the Flints and one to his good father Hoster. Someone, somewhere must be watching the Ironborn. If he became truly desperate, Ned might need to reach out to the Lannisters or Tyrells. An issue for another time, Ned decided. For now, he had men to hunt. Forward slash 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 forward slash. Chapter 23, Beyond Glory, Lies Truth. Chapter text. As Pride of Stain slipped past Eastwatch by the sea, Jon's blood ran hot. He could taste the difference in the air. It was by the light of the moon, under a pitch-black sky. Jon was watching with Bourne for any hint of activity along the coast. The Skagga Sea sailors were deft hands at silent sailing, no open flames, little to no rowing and carefully strapped down fixtures. Jon was trying to get a glimpse of the wall itself. He made out the skeletal docks jutting out from the rocks, took note of the sentry posts near the vague shape of a castle. Jon took a deep breath, thought of breaking his silence to interrupt Bourne, when the moon disappeared. Jon looked around, wildly, horribly confused. None of the crew bothered to pause in their work. He turned back to Eastwatch, which stood out even brighter with its fires. The light had not fled entirely, a line of silver spilled unnaturally in a line across the sky. By the old gods, Jon murmured. The moon had not disappeared, their ship had sailed into the shadow of the wall. The monolith of ice swallowed the sky. Ghost, quietly sitting by Jon's side, stood. The wolf was entranced, just like Jon. Cold wind howled across the bay. Jon could taste the frost, his grey doublet and green cloak looked pitch black. A voice slithered to his ears, for the watch. Jon fell back, hard onto his back, clutching at his chest. The voice whispered again, clearer this time, Jon, it was a kind voice, we're past danger now, we don't have to stay on lookout for the watch. Bourne gently took Jon's elbow and propped him up. Moonlight splashed across the deck as their ship passed the wall. Jon felt relief at the sight of his tunic being whole, his chest unhurt. Ghost padded over and nosed his way under Jon's chin. Jon gave a deep sigh of relief and let Bourne guide him to their bunk. The rest of their journey was less horrifying. The ruins of Hardham, the occasional small group of fishing boats. Bourne had even pointed out a strange wave of water, identifying it as the trail of a real whale. Jon was amazed at the untamed and icy vastness. Their captain obeyed Shepherd Tiller, who Bourne would mistakenly call aunt if he wasn't paying attention, to head west after passing Storrold's Point. They matched the backwards curve of Knifeback Shore, staying in sight of the shale beaches. They dropped anchor at the mouth of the Antler River, north of the haunted forest. Even from there they could see the wall, looming like a rectangular mountain. Unnatural in its uniformity but so covered by ice that it could have sprouted from the earth. A smaller raft took their party to the land. Time was of the essence, Tiller drove a harsh pace. A little over half a league from their landing, they found a godswood with a moderate-sized clearing. This will do, Tiller decided. Brod, Vom, Raider should be nearby. Find him. The two shepherds, Tiller's son and daughter, took a seat beneath the weirwoods and grasped hands. Jon knew the two preferred to walk as one, Bourne warned it was a dangerous and delicate tradition, rarely taught. The Skagga Sea were fully armed and wary. They'd spread out around them. Jon heard their orders were to kill the wildlings if they attacked and then retreat to the boat with all haste. Though Bourne warned him the sailors would prioritize Tiller, Brod and them's safety over him and John. Less than an hour passed when Brod and them snapped out of their trance. They're on their way, them told her mother. John was ushered with the other shepherds to the cover of the Hartree. Bourne pulled up John's hood while the rest donned masks. Though he'd received plenty of instruction, John had yet to decide if he would take the final steps on becoming a shepherd, thus had no weirwood mask of his own. Ghost was the first to warn of their guests. No growl or bark, a simple tensed spine let John know all he needed to. Before even Tiller was alerted, John turned his head to the southwest where a group of people entered the clearing. Less than a dozen wildlings moved out of the foliage, each decked in furs. They seemed wary but calm. They formed a rough line, mirroring the Skagga Sea. Behind them was a trio, one man and two women. The man, who John assumed was the chieftain they'd come to meet, was slender with a barrel chest. He had long brown hair streaked with grey. What drew John's attention was his shrewd brown eyes set in a sharp face. There was an air about him, even before speaking, that John noticed. In the way others deferred to him, looked at him before acting. The two women both had high cheekbones, long hair and pale blue eyes. John wondered if they were sisters. One had softer features and darker hair compared to the second's dim blonde coloring. Both wore breeches and boots beneath thick coats, spears clutched securely in their mitts. Tiller stepped forward. "Are you Raider?" she asked. Her voice was muffled by the mask, but the shepherds knew how to project through it, adding an undercurrent of strength to their words. "I am." Raider called back. "Who are you?" "Tiller, I am here on behalf of the Great Shepherd." "That's good," Raider said. "He heard my request then." "Heard, but not granted." Tiller pointed out, "What reason do you have to seek out the Great Shepherd?" Raider paused as the dark-haired woman leaned to his ear. "I want the Great Shepherd to act as an intermediary between myself and a child of the forest," Raider declared. John shared confused looks with the other shepherds. "If you seek a child, then surely you can find one. There are godswoods aplenty here beyond the wall." Tiller pointed out. "I doubt a chieftain like you is without loyal greenseers." Raider tried to hide a grimace. "The children have been rarely seen in the last year, even by the most devout of our people. They've gone further and further south, we've lost all trace of them. The children were legendary in their stealth. Outside of the one John had met on Skagos, it was rare for any other than the Great Shepherd to see them. Even so, Torrin had mentioned it was the children who sought him out, and only in extremely rare cases. Shepherds with potent green sight could sense a child's presence through the weirwoods. If the hardened elders living among the wildlings said the children had disappeared, few would doubt them. Something was going on beyond the wall. "Do you have any idea why?" Tiller wondered. Raider tilted his chin up. "Perhaps. But that's between me and the Great Shepherd, I think." Tiller turned her back on the wildlings, to John and the others. "I don't like this," she informed them. "He knows more than he revealed. I'm tempted to leave right now. A king beyond the wall keen on visiting Skagos doesn't sit well with me." John guessed that Brod and them would follow their mother. He glanced at Bourne, equally reluctant to speak against his father's friend. Mustering up courage, John leaned forward. "There's nothing stopping them from slipping past the wall and stealing a boat," John pointed out. "The fact he's gone to this length, trying to gain a proper escort, must mean something." Tiller paused, looked back across the clearing where Raider and the two women also conversed. "Perhaps you're right. If we brought them with us, they'd be hard-pressed to sneak off." Tiller acknowledged. "If the children really are missing, we must find out why," John prompted. Tiller looked down at John. "You make a good argument, but mind yourself," she reprimanded. John nodded and stepped back. Bourne bumped shoulders with him. "If you truly have dark tidings, then you shall meet the Great Shepherd. You and your warriors may come to Skagos," Tiller declared. "Be warned, any hint of treachery or malice will be met with blade and shield. On the Isle of Stone, even the roots shall betray one who spills the Great Shepherd's blood." Appearing suitably cowed, Raider nodded and gave orders for half his guards to grab their supplies. Keeping a respectful distance, the two groups made for the coast. The ride back to Skagos was simple. The wildlings were confined to a set of quarters and John was never let out of Bourne's sight. He caught a few of the looks Raider had been giving Ghost, so he didn't fuss much. Overall, the chieftain little resembled old Nan's bedside tales of half-mad plunderers looking to steal northern prosperity. Raider himself wore ringmail, old ringmail by the look of it, and his cloak had luminous red silk sewn into it. He noticed one of the women, the something, seemed particularly close to Raider. She had a bronze cuff with what might have been an amber jewel. John didn't even begin to think of the blonde, her name was Val, who'd stuck out to him. As they boarded the ship, she'd caught him sneaking a glance from beneath his hood. He tried to be subtle, but she shot a strange smirk at him. John had determinedly avoided even looking near the woman after that. From the way Raider treated Val, she held a measure of his respect and by John's count was only 2 or 3 years older than him. Woodpicking, seeking counsel from barely grown children and meeting with potential enemies. Life beyond the wall was strange. Forward slash 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 forward slash. Rather than basket, they made landfall on the northern coast, at a stone dock. Tiller had some kind of pull with the stands. Exactly how much became clear when the Stain heir, Lan, met them on the beach, embraced her and called her wife. John could only shake his head. Even here, in what the Maestas would consider a backwater, uncivilized corner of West Eos, blood and marriage brought allegiance and resources. Raider and his followers were housed in the center of town and a trio of loyal men were posted outside at all hours. They were left to their own devices while the finer details of the summit were planned out. Naturally, people who are used to their freedom do not enjoy being imprisoned. It took a Stain man getting his cheek broken for the great shepherd to relent. Wolf Tongue kept Myra well clear of them. Instead, he charged Bourne with taking Raider for short excursions along the coasts and to the Godswood for prayer. John was to stay away, Torrin had insisted on it. He had a limit though, after Wolf Tongue prompted him to escort Myra on yet another of her mundane tasks, he escaped down to the coast and joined Bourne. John sat with them for dinner one evening. Raider was a gifted storyteller, a seemingly endless number of old legends and irreverent songs flew from his tongue. After finishing an amusing tale about ancient chieftains fighting for the right to marry a mammoth, he began another. In olden days, before the war, before even the long night. When the Green Hand guided our ancestors across the sea from the east. 2 brothers followed him. They were fierce warriors on their own, but together they could kill even a giant. None doubted their strength or their friendship, their bonds of brotherhood were rooted through to the heart. In the lands of the west, the men warred and burned, driving ever northward. These brothers among them. Proud and stalwart they were. Hunting from dawn to dusk to fill the stomachs of their children. They fought and fought. Against children, men, beasts and any who would stand against them. There came a point. One brother had his fill. He built a home and sat in it, content to watch and rest. The other brother could not stop. Would not stop. The bloody brother would hunt from dawn to the moon's rise. All began to fear him. One night, the brother devoured a child of the forest. For this, he was cursed. They say his teeth grew long, his nails became claws and his hair shifted to fur. He no longer spoke the tongues of men, his eyes no longer recognized his fellow folk, he only cared for the taste of warm flesh. The man-wolf made his den in the deepest woods. He ranged far and wide. Taking women, children, cattle, all to be bled and devoured. It became too much. The first brother, now with children grown, took up his bronze sword, bid his family farewell and walked into the forest in the midst of autumn. He walked and walked, until at last he came upon the Godswood. In the hollow of the tree, beneath a faceless weirwood, the man-wolf slept. With no fear. No hesitation. Brother killed brother. No man is so accursed as the kinslayer. To repay his affront, the brother ended his own life there, at that spot, so he and his siblings' blood may mix and join their souls forevermore. The next day, the eldest son followed his father's tracks and came upon the Godswood. Above the 2 corpses, a face had been carved into the tree. The son wept, for he knew it had been love that drove both kinsmen to doom. He wrapped his sire's body in hide, then skinned his uncle and burned the bones. He returned to his hall, now as its leader, with a corpse on his horse and a wolfskin cloak. He thrust open the doors as a terrible snowstorm descended on the land. Raider had been focused unbroken on the fire as he recounted the story. John, and everyone else, were so enraptured, the fire had faded to embers. In an instant, Raider's gaze snapped from the cooling ash to John, and he smiled, forebodingly. The people who welcomed him looked upon the sun and whispered. There comes the blood of wolf. There comes the blood of man. There comes a Stark soul. Winter has come with him. Bourne leaped to his feet, shoved John back towards the door and grabbed a knife from the floor. Peace, Shepherd, peace. Raider said. None of us will break guest right, least of all me. The storyteller motioned John to return to the fire, where it was being rekindled. You did a fine job of keeping yourself hidden in plain sight, young man. Unfortunately for you, this wasn't the first time I've met a Stark, Jon Snow. John blushed as he sat across from him. Val and Dalla were laughing at him. Bourne forgot in his haste how much stronger he was than John. He'd been thrown end over end. You've met my uncle. John guessed. A few times. He occasionally visited the Shadow Tower. That wasn't what I was referring to. I had the honor of seeing you, your brother and father all together in one room. John frowned. I accompanied Lord Commander Corgyle on a visit to Winterfell after Lord Eddard returned from the rebellion. You were quite young. Raider explained, then pointed to Ghost, sleeping by the door. If nothing else, the Direwolf was a more obvious hint. Rumors have even reached beyond the wall that the Starks have living sigils at their sides. Raider chuckled and all present took the news with good humor. Rather than separating John from the wildlings, having his true identity revealed lowered the barriers between them. Dalla and Raider spent all of their time together. John guessed they were wed, or something close to it. Val would just laugh when he brought it up. As the only visitor near his age, the others seemed to pair them up more often than not. She was full of questions. What was life like in a castle, she asked him. What was life like in the wilds, he would say. Then she'd look at him. Val did that a lot, look surprised when he'd ask her something. He wasn't sure why. It was nice. Never had to worry about my next meal. I had teachers and maids. A good life. John eventually admitted, after explaining what a maid was. Out of everything, Val kept returning to how the Starks ruled. John had trouble explaining it to her satisfaction. They'd gone down to the piers to fish one evening and gotten back on the topic. I understand where the goods come from, John. Free folk give tribute too. Val said, casting her line out. What I don't understand is why. If you have your own ground castle, your own weapons, your own food, then why would you give it up and kneel to someone else? You might not kneel, Val, but you follow Raider. John pointed out. Val frowned, it's not the same. Are you so sure? John wondered. If man's starting acting like a dumb fool, we'd pack our camp and leave. Inspired, John pointed at her, exactly. You leave. Except, if you have a ground castle and farms, you can't just leave. It's not like beyond the wall, people put down roots, make a home to last. Not all free folk wander with the winds, Val rebutted. There are villages and camps, not to mention the things in their valley. John could understand Val's confusion. From what he'd learned, allegiance between the tribes came through numbers, battle or charisma. If for any reason, one of those pillars disappeared, the tribes would fracture. If their departure wasn't taken well by their leader, they'd fight through the loyal followers in the process. That might be a key problem with his attempts to explain. Even in these villages they had no crops, only hunting to feed themselves. Imagine this instead, John suggested. You and your tribe live along a river. Your ancestors built a hole on the banks of that river. It has been your home and your mother's home and her father's before that. Near your home are fertile lands, where you grow grain and raise hogs. You can feed your family, and trade any excess to your close neighbor for wool. Val followed along, picturing it in her mind. She remembered descriptions of southern lands from raiders. It seemed fantastical to her. Then, one of your neighbors kills a kinsman of yours. What do you do? John asked. The neighbor's life is ours to take, they can't be trusted. Val responds. What if the murderer's family refused? Then we stop trading with them. Now you have no wool and they have no grain. John pointed out. The next year, a group comes from the south, far to the south, and they attack you. They kill your family, steal your grain. They do the same to your neighbors and you are both left weakened. You now worry these enemies will return. It was simplistic. Honestly, too simplistic. John made sure Val understood that. She forgave him for his own lacking knowledge, after all he was no greybeard or wise woman. One day, a rider comes to you and your neighbor. They sit you down and say to you, my king wishes for pork, grain and wool. In exchange, you will be protected from raiders and the king will give you justice. Val hummed, she reeled in a decent-sized fish, will this king give us the murderer's life? John nodded, he will come and take the head himself. Val liked the notion, but we'd have to give him a share of our goods. One comes for the other. John explained. What if the king fails in his promises? What if he takes our grain and lets us be raided anyways? Val asked. Then next year, he will have no grain, pork or wool, because you will be dead. Val set her pole to the side. When winter comes, when our crops die and the pigs freeze, what then? Then the king shall provide. John stated. He is no king without subjects. It rankled Val's spirit, to think of having a single individual who she had no choice but to follow. This, she could acknowledge, was part of her upbringing. She looked out across the piers, and saw children playing in the water, watched men and women work. Perhaps she had also simplified things. There were plenty of chieftains who governed through fear, whose people followed so they wouldn't be killed. Was it really all that different? Unknown to John, she pictured the empty villages and the creeping ice. No matter how fierce the free folk boasted they had never crossed the wall for good. They were always broken by the kneelers. These people placed shackles on themselves, but those shackles created a kingdom and it had power. Mance wanted them to come south and stay there. If they wished to survive, would her people wear the shackles? Could she? If it meant Dalla lived a long, happy life. If your fanciful story were true, perhaps I would kneel. Val said, and let the matter drop. They enjoyed the quiet together, the peaceful waxing of the water. Val, why is Raider so desperate for this meeting? The beautiful wilderling, free folk, John corrected himself, her hair gleaming in the sun and eyes staring into his, reached over and ran a single rough finger down his cheek. Across the scar from his fight with the drunken Skagasi. Death marches, Jon Snow, death marches in the true north. Val whispered. John frowned. A plague of some kind. It felt deeper than that, ominous. A simple truth, as old Nan might say. Lord Snow. A man called from the village. It was one of Raider's men. One spawn explained that John's father might as well be called the king behind the wall, they'd taken it upon themselves to endlessly tease him. Val laughed, quiet down, Falf. If anyone should be called a lady it's me. Falf smirked, as you wish, Lady Snow. John looked over and saw Val blush brightly and look to the sky. John picked up their poles and hurried ahead, he hoped she missed his matching flush. Their catch was cooked that evening for a filling sup. Bourne was in basket on a task from Wolf Tongue. Val and Dalla had taken the evening for themselves, leaving John and Mance together after their meal. We're alone now, John. Feel free to ask. Mance remarked as he took out his instrument. Ask about what? Mance smirked and continued to tune his strings. The suggestion wormed into John's head, circling and circling until he couldn't resist. Why did you abandon your vows? Raider was a private man, he revealed little to nothing by chance. A woman saved my life and gave me a gift. The watch said I could not keep it. Raider told him, it was freedom, I found I couldn't live without. John swallowed, a few years ago I begged my father to let me join. To serve with my uncle, he admitted. Raider shook his head, it's not a life you choose at such a young age. Didn't you? Raider barked, no. By all the gods, no. My father was a ranger, my mother a spear wife. They met, they bedded, I was the result. The watch found me when they killed my tribe, took me in. When I turned 10 and 3, I took the oath. What else was I going to do? Raider took in John's confusion and conflicted feelings. I had never seen the world. Never knew a life outside the wall. The watch needed men, so none of the commanders tried to stop me. Raider strummed his lute. I gave up the world and never even knew it. Echoes of Uncle Benjamin was all John heard. A life he would have chosen gladly. So little time had passed, but so much had changed. Unlike Raider, unlike Benjamin, John had the whole world open to him. It was terrifying. The door to the cabin opened. Ghost padded in, followed by Val and Dalla. They sat down, Val beside John. Ghost, the giant fool, flopped down right against their legs, trapping John's knees against Val's. Val laughed and grabbed onto his shoulder to stop her fall. John smiled. The whole world was open to him. Forward slash 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 forward slash. Chapter 24, following the tracks. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. There has been no word from the Gittons, Lord Stark. Taking a deep breath, Ned absorbed Lord Roderick's announcement quietly. Whether by ill luck or sabotage, they had not received any responses from House Glover either. We cannot tarry, Ned decided. At his command the gates of Swift Bank were opened. Ned rode out ahead of his 80 men-at-arms and 40 horsemen, behind them came Lord Roderick and Roger with 20 men-at-arms and 60 horsemen in Risswell livery. Their force numbered 200 all told, not counting the smaller retinues of sworn swords that accompanied each lord. Following the well-maintained paths, Roderick led them to Lame Leg Crossing just north of Swift Bank. They forded the low point in the river and began their search. Quickly coming upon a few farms and hamlets built along the edge of the rill, separated by rocky hills and small crevices. Owned by small folk who eked out simple lives with little in the way of luxury even compared to those near Winterfell. They recognized the Direwolf and Horsehead sigil well enough. Ned learned smaller bands of refugees had continued making their way east over the last week, though their numbers had lessened considerably. The brigands appeared content to remain near the sea. Aiming further south, they made good time to the edge of Blazewater Bay before turning west. Wary of any ambushes, Ned ensured small scouting parties ranged ahead of them, investigating any homesteads or shelters for traps. It was fortunate they did. 2 days later, Ned had finished breaking his fast with Roderick and Roger when a sentry called out, "Riders returning." With captives. The lords assembled outside. The Argyll brothers and their men cantered into camp. Tied to the back of a saddle were 2 bruised and battered men. Lord Stark. Orin called out, "We captured these men some leagues west. They were picking through a burnt-out farmstead. Fine work, all of you. Take your men and grab some food." Ned ordered. "Sir Roderick, secure these criminals." In proper order, both prisoners were manacled in separate tents. The 2 men had uncut hair and numerous scars, they certainly resembled bandits. The Argylls had stripped their arms and armor along with any stolen goods. Ned knew there was an art to interrogation. He stood outside the tents, listening as Roderick's men handled the questioning. They were making little headway. Neither of the prisoners spoke, even after a few blows. However, all it took was a single slip. "What are you doing with the villagers? You've violated the laws of the gods by taking slaves." The interrogator pressed. "Just thralls." It was only whispered, but Ned's ears were sharp. Ned threw open the tent flap and barged in. He took a seat, the interrogator standing as his guard. The posture of the prisoner straightened, his eyes brightened, wariness and hatred twisted his face. Ned schooled his features, embraced the moniker of the Quiet Wolf. "You will tell me of your presence in my lands," he ordered. His prisoner swallowed some kind of retort. Ned could hear him twisting his shackles. They sat in silence for a time. Another tactic was needed. "Did you fight at Pike?" Ned asked. Another strangled answer. The prisoner was breathing heavily, his temper frayed. Ned's own fury was beginning to rise. These murderers saw fit to reave the lands of his family, saw fit to steal what belonged to his people. His heart sped up, the rhythmic pace had become more and more common over the last year. Ned wasn't surprised when Moore nudged the tent open and stalked in. That got the brigands' attention. More came up to Ned's ribs. Seated as he was, More towered over the prisoner. Ned saw the sweat form and drip down his face. The interrogator stepped closer and whispered, "Lord Stark, a map was found among their things." The temptation to unleash more was palpable. Ned stood, took a deep breath and slowed his heart. More stepped back and sat as a sentry. Outside, Roderick and Roger bent over a scrap of thick vellum laid across a makeshift table. "Lord Stark, we think we've found their base," Roger explained. "It seems the raiders made a map to avoid getting lost. They landed along a wide length of beach within sight of Hookamel, House Hooks Township. Once they'd occupied it, they moved further north to Till's Mill." Ned nodded, tracing the routes on the makeshift map. "So they've split themselves. The group that delved into Glover lands must have originated at the mill. If they are here for lumber, it would be best to harvest along the fringes of the Wolf's Wood, then send it down the coast to their larger ships." Lord Roderick frowned. "They are Ironborn then?" Ned reached down and picked up the large bag of stolen goods. He dumped it out onto the table. A bunch of turnips, some wooden cutlery and a pair of knives spilled out with ease. Beneath that was a chainmail shirt, a worn-down gamison, an axe, dagger, an arming sword and strangely, a belt made of thick hair. "I am convinced they are. Reavers or no, when they catch sight of us they'll flee for the sea," Ned revealed. "I want you to send a swift rider to House Glover. They are to march down the coast into the shore in 1 week. We will do the same from the bay." Lord Ricard hummed, "If our timing is right, the Glovers will drive the ones at Till's Mill down to Hookamel. In the confusion they'll start planning a strategic retreat with as much as they can carry." Roger jumped in, smiling widely, "Then we'll catch them by surprise and cut them off from the ships." "If all goes to plan," Ned reminded. "What are we to do with the prisoners?" Roderick asked. Ned re-examined the captured weapons and armor. The chainmail and sword spoke of wealth and connection to a skilled blacksmith. The blades of the Iron Islands were always sharp, always straight, fine pieces of work all. Ned saw that on the hilt of the sword was a small war-horn sigil seared into the pommel. On the table, the belt of hair was brushed around by the wind. Turning back to his personal tent, Ned went inside and opened the pages of the Hungry Wolf's diaries. He flipped through page after page, searching for a half-remembered passage that was there. "A great haul from the battle today. I walked with Barris among the corpses of their Magnus, taking choice trophies from each. Bloody moon pendant from a WYCH of Pike. Whalebone earring from a Vomark of Harlaw. Goat hair belt from a good brother of Great WYK. Storming out, he called, 'Lord Roger, fetch us some wine. We now have a hostage.' The raider was young enough to be one of Lord Gorald Goodbrother's sons. More had maintained his watch. The good brother was too terrified to flinch at Ned's entrance. He set the wine sack down in front of the man's feet. "Forgive me, I have acted improperly," Ned apologized, confusing the prisoner. "If I'd known my men had captured a good brother of Hammerhorn, you would have received better quarters." Ned barreled on, not even providing a pause to be answered. "Though perhaps I've misjudged you. After all, no lord of Hammerhorn would be sent on such a minor errand as stealing tree trunks. Perhaps your kin rules from Crowspike or Dondelving. That would fit better." On and on Ned goaded for nearly 10 minutes. The good brother, for Ned was now certain of his identity, became red in the face and his neck and biceps bulged. "I wonder if your father will pay ransom for you." "Perhaps not." Ned slid the proverbial knife in, taken directly from King Roderick Stark, who had driven the Ironborn from Cape Crooken. Any Ironborn caught on land might as well be gelded then forgotten. What driftwood lord would pay the gold price for a failure? "I am no failure," the man thundered. Ned nodded, no sign of the smugness he felt. "True. Every captain who sailed with you will soon share the same fate. Make it easier on yourself and I'll ensure your body is given back to the sea." How many ships crossed the bay? It was like pulling hen's teeth. More was needed to fully coax the man into compliance. Yet he'd broken his silence. In a way he admitted defeat. 4 longships sailed from Great WYK, each crewed by 30 or 40 souls. The good brother hadn't known their purpose or who had ordered the raid, only that his grandfather, so not a son of Lord Goodbrother after all, had called for men to row and reeve. They'd made landfall, killed any who resisted and put the rest in chains. His crew had been sent to scrounge foodstuffs away from Hukamel while the majority of the men set off, taking the thralls to begin chopping down trees. Ned stood at the end of their talk, reached over, and allowed the noble to take a few gulps of wine. He left for the final time, found Lord Roderick and ordered the 2 prisoners to be sent back to Swift Bank. They would be judged in due time. With only a desperate hope that the Glovers would be ready, Ned marched with his 200 men to clash with at least 120 Ironborn. Forward slash 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 forward slash. The sparsity of Stony Shore was apparent everywhere Ned looked. There was enough to carve out a small life but nowhere near the resources available to even the mountain clans. He conversed with Lord Roderick, asking why his house never pushed for direct rule of the shore. Quite simple, my lord, no good land for horse rearing and we've no need for more fish with the rill by our feet. Ned considered the Stony Shore. How the only truly powerful house to ever claim it prior to the Starks were the Warg Kings, from their home on Sea Dragon Point. The Warg Kings had access to the Wolf's Wood, the northern tip of the Rill River. The shore was used as a source of taxes and manpower for their wars against the Glovers and Riders. House Fisher could barely be counted, the Stark records were so devoid of information on them they were mostly hearsay after the conquest. The Fishers were poor and held power because they were the only ones on the shore who bothered to. A few political marriages, some kind of debt from the Glovers for a favor long past, secured their neutrality in the region. Their house lived with the small folk and their scant vassals in compliance and complacency. They would sail to Barrowtown and sell their large catches of crabs, lobsters and clams, but little else. They certainly never stopped any Ironborn invasions, frequently being the first to pay tribute to any longships that came across them. At best, the Fishers provided early warning to the rest of the north when their boats and cogs went missing. Ned resolved that for anyone to desire the Stony Shore, or the gods willing, prosper here, new wealth must be found. Each idea he could summon up was easily countered. Any new ports or shipyards would be better served further inland, at Barrowtown or Torrens Square. A new fortress akin to the Wolf's Den would suit the Rill River and Saltspear rather than the coast. The scant farmlands meant no place for a winter refuge. When the snow set in, the shorefolk retreated to Deepwood Motte or Swift Bank. The grey peaks and spikes once again drew Ned's eye. The rocky hills that round the length of the land up to the southern edge of the Wolf's Wood. Perhaps members of the mountain clans could be persuaded to survey the area. Minerals may yet be found hidden in the crags and caves. If there was at least the promise of some unearthed resource, it would be far easier to find a house to accept stewardship over the area. A new masterly house would be best, as to not cause offense to the Glovers or risk tensions with the Riswells. Another project for another year, Ned sadly decided. These thoughts and his daily duties occupied Ned's time until the eve of battle arrived. Camped out far enough away from Hukamel but close enough for their coming charge, Ned sought solitude away from his men. The Greyjoy Rebellion had only been 7 years ago, less than a decade. The Iron Fleet's initial attacks had focused on the Westerlands, aside from that misguided siege of Seaguard. Ned had no doubts that if they had the time, the longships would have attacked Cape Crooken. This whole chain of events presented a dire warning that Balon Greyjoy may once again be heading straight on into madness. The siege of Pike had been a bloody day, but one that reminded the rest of the kingdoms that the North was not a foe to be trifled with. Stark, Bolton and Umber banners flew over the rubble of Botley Castle as the Northern Foot cut a bloody path through the defenders in Lordsport. Robert had breached Pike itself, but Ned had captured the ramparts. It was his bannerman who had killed Maron Greyjoy. It was strange to look back and realize how momentous that occasion had been. Not the invasion of the Iron Islands as a whole, the Westerlands had put the Isles to the torch more than once. Rather that Ned was the first Stark to ever attack the islands themselves, despite the long history of war between their two kingdoms. He had stood in the throne room of Pike and watched the King of the Iron Islands pulled from the seastone chair and brought to his knees. It was hard to imagine that in the future the Quiet Wolf might be a name remembered alongside the Hungry and the Laughing. For Ned had seen much war, more than many of his predecessors. Focused as he was on memories of battle, Ned's heart quickened. The fresh night air whipped past his hair as he crept up the hillside, keeping low to the ground. The rocks gave plenty of steady footing. Slinking up the hillside under the moonlight, he reached an overlook that gave a wide view of the field below. Scant grass and gravel carpeting the way to the distant wave-drenched shore. Far in the distance the hinting notes of smoke and roasted meat underscored the occasional shout or argument. He could easily imagine those shouts turning to screams, the roasted meat overwhelmed by blood. Stomping forward, he raised his head and unleashed a terrible howl, a warning. It echoed off the cliffs and stone, folding in on itself. His foes quieted, their laughter and arguments forgotten. In some deep, secret part of them, their hearts trembled. They would sleep uneasily tonight, unwilling to admit that their fates had come calling. Forward slash 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 forward slash. Notes. And hope everyone is enjoying the story and staying safe. My sibling and I managed to catch bronchitis, but not COVID thankfully. We're reaching a climax for both John and Ned. I'm very excited for this, as you can probably tell, by how fast I'm pumping these chapters out. I was looking for some feedback. With the Ironborn being brought into play, I need to decide what to do with Theon. I'm toying with the idea of having him learn about the harsh realities of Ironborn history. Not by simply having him confront the idiocy of his father, but also learning about the periods of prosperity and strength his people reached when following the New Way, like under the rulership of his grandfather, Quayan, or the Hoare dynasty. This is a fix-it fic, but I don't want to make things too easy for anyone. What do you think? Chapter 25, Fighting for Survival. Chapter text. Ned's armor was strapped tight and proper. The plate fit comfortably across his shoulder and his legs were free to move. Sir Roderick had been meticulous in his training, so the Argyll brothers were nearly experts at the task by this point. He ran his hand across the shield on his left arm. A grey direwolf on a white field, the same sigil he had worn into battle during the rebellion. Robert had tried to convince him to create a personal coat of arms, but it felt inappropriate. He knew Brandon had added a sword in the wolf's hands, and his father had added a pair of jeweled bracelets to his. Such performatives had always seemed frivolous, but it was past time he did. Perhaps a burning longship. Ned smiled to himself. At Ned's waist was a sturdy blade from Winterfell's forge. Ice had remained in the castle. A great sword was impractical for all but the most desperate battles. His ancestral blade served well for official duties, but few Stark lords in the past had trained specifically to wield the huge blade in real combat. Stepping out of his tent, Ned surveyed the men as they readied for battle. Lord Roderick was speaking intently with Roger, no doubt imparting last words of advice. The heir to Swift Bank would be by his father's side, but the midst of the charge was not the place for morbid goodbyes. "Are the men ready?" Ned asked Sir Roderick. His master-at-arms was similarly decked out in his full-plate armor. His shield of 10 wolf heads, the sigil of House Castle, included a single grey head at the base of the image, a nod to Roderick's position of prestige in Winterfell. Sir Roderick had both a sword and a mace at the ready. The gruff man had quietly passed over a letter to his daughter, Beth, and nephew, Jory, the night before. A true veteran of the field, Ned was always glad to have Castle at his side. "Yes, my lord," Sir Roderick replied. "The foot have been mustered and the archers ordered. They await us." Ned waved over to the Roswells in a final gesture before setting off, Sir Roderick and the Argyll brothers behind him. Moore was out in the bushes near camp, keeping a wary eye on their targets. The northern soldiers stood in clean ranks, arrayed behind the hill they would walk over. Then for 10 minutes they would cross open fields to reach Hookermill. The route had been carefully marked out by scouts in the dead of night. Lord Sewin addressed the infantry, ensuring Ned's orders were clear and understood. "I now present to you, the Warden of the North, Lord Eddard Stark." Sewin shouted. The infantry fell quiet, all eyes rested on Ned. He took a deep breath. The killing would start soon, so would the dying. Unlike Robert, who found these pre-battle speeches invigorating, Ned only found they hardened his nerves and swelled his fears. "Men of Winterfell, men of Swift Bank," Ned called out. "Our march today has one purpose. These brigands have deemed the North weak, and think our land ripe for We shall teach them